A quick like and subscribe really helps our channel grow and allows us to bring you even more amazing content. Thank you for your support.
When I first heard people talk about haunted houses, I rolled my eyes, thinking they were just getting caught up in the hype, exaggerating stories for fun. That was until I volunteered to help set up a charity haunted house with some friends last October. It seemed harmless enough, a way to raise money and some good fun. The building itself, an old, creaking orphanage that had been closed for decades, was the perfect frame for our little project, its peeling paint and broken windows lending it an air of authenticity. We spent countless nights painting fake blood on the walls, setting up cobwebs, and installing props that would give anyone a scare. I remember sharing infectious laughter, joking about how much we were overdoing it, relishing in the thrill of creating an atmosphere of fear. But once the lights went out and the first group of terrified teenagers wandered through, I felt the tides of the night shift. The air grew thick with something I couldn't quite name, a tension that squeezed at my chest. I smiled at my friends who were plastered with fake wounds, but deep down, I felt uneasy. It was just a haunted house, right? Then the whispers started. At first, I chalked them up to the wind creeping through the cracks in the walls or the groans of the old building settling like a worn-out sigh. But as the night wore on, the whispers grew clearer, more intentional, my name, my past, slivers from my childhood that I had buried deep. I tried to shake it off, focusing on the giggles and screams from outside, but when we finally took a break, I ventured into the heart of the orphanage, lured by a soft, urgent tone that echoed in the empty halls. I followed it, my heart pounding, until I reached the room that once housed dozens of abandoned children. Dust motes danced in the dim light from my flashlight, and for a moment, time stopped. That's when I saw it, a small girl, no older than 8, with tattered clothes and hair matted with dirt that hung around her face like a curtain. I blinked, surprised that one of my friends was already pulling a prank on me, but as I stepped closer, she looked up, her eyes wide and hollow. "They don't want you here," she whispered, her voice muted and fragile like glass. I felt a chill race down my spine, and panic forced me to retreat, but it was too late. I could hear muffled laughter echoing from behind me, but instead of my friends, I found inches from my face another figure, this one cloaked in dark shadows, grinning with sharp teeth. I stumbled backward and fell, realizing that I wasn't in the realm of pranks anymore. Scrambling to my feet, I barely recognized the familiar doorway to the exit. It felt like the walls themselves were breathing, folding in and out, urging me to stay. I dashed through the dark, calling out to my friends, but all I met were their scattered voices echoing from different rooms. The air got heavier, the whispers now turned into soft cries, pleading and mournful, and I found myself trapped in a nightmare. I broke through a door and stumbled into what was once the kitchen, my breath quickening when I saw features similar to the little girl reflected in my own. Also similar, were they all lost? The lights pulsated, and suddenly, I wasn't alone. Shadows lurked in the corners, bubbling up like smoke, while pale hands reached out to me, calling me to join them, to surrender myself to whatever realm they inhabited. I darted to another room, frantically searching for an escape, until I noticed a mirror. Staring back at me wasn't just my face, I noticed the small girl behind me, more solid than before, more desperate. I knew this was insane, but feeling a force beyond comprehension, I reached out to her, listening to her soft whispers urging me to take her hand. Chills ran through my spine as the truth unfolded in my mind, the blur between past and present dissolved, and within moments, I realized I was not merely experiencing a haunted house, I had stepped into a realm woven from the fears and forgotten memories of those lost long ago. With every fiber of my being, I fought back, the warmth slipping from my grasp. Just as I thought I was lost forever, a burst of laughter broke through the void, the door swung wide open, revealing my friends approaching, smiles plastered on their faces, non-aware of the terror lurking behind me. But I could feel it, pressing down like a weight I couldn't escape. I shouted, warned them, but my voice was swallowed by the shadows, their smiles morphing into blank stares. It was as if I was the only one aware of the danger. I seized one of my friends, pleading him to turn back, but he laughed, thinking I was beginning to creep him out instead. As I pushed against the palpable darkness, I could almost feel hands clasping around my throat, squeezing tighter, promising me a fate with the lost souls in that forgotten place. In a desperate bid to escape, I yanked at the door and sprinted out, hearing laughter transform to screams, feeling the shadows clawing behind me, grasping at my clothes, begging for my essence. I burst outside into the crisp night, shivering as I turned back to witness everything I had just left, the flickering lights of the haunted house, only now it didn't look like a fun attraction, it seemed alive, a predator hiding amongst the reminders of youth. I never set foot in that place again, but every October since, I remember that little girl, and the shadows slithering closer each time I hear someone say, "It's just a haunted house." And maybe it is, maybe for some it's just a bit of bloody fun, but for me, it became a vivid lesson. There are echoes of truths in the night that we dare to ignore, whispers from those who tried to warn us, and some experiences are far too real to ever let go. Growing up, the whispers of our family warned of a place lost to time, a dense, ancient forest bordering our property, shrouded in mist and mystery. My grandma, the keeper of family lore, would lean in close each holiday dinner, eyes aglow, recounting tales of fairies dwelling within the tangled woods, guardians of nature's secrets. She claimed they weren't the fluttering, benign sprites of children's books, but rather sentinels, fiercely protective, easily aggrieved. It was tradition that every autumn, before the first frost, we set a table at the forest's edge, a makeshift family dinner where we'd ceremoniously leave offerings, honey, milk, and warm bread for the forest dwellers. My sister, Lisa, ever the skeptic, called it our weird family picnic and viewed it as an eccentricity we indulged in for Grandma's sake. But there was an unspoken understanding, a silent agreement to never skip this ritual. That was until last year when Lisa insisted we stop pandering to old superstitions. Yet, that night, I dreamed fitfully of the forest, shadows twisting and trees whispering my name, beckoning, and pleading. Morning broke with a chilling freeze, a stark contrast to the unseasonably warm October. Despite my reservations, I agreed with Lisa in not performing the ritual that year, more out of annoyance than belief. Over dinner that evening in the comfort of our home, the air seemed heavier, the tick of the old clock in Grandma's dining room slicing through silence louder than I ever remembered. We exchanged half-hearted laughs, the eerie quiet broken only by the occasional clink of dinnerware. Halfway through the meal, the lights blinked out, plunging us into darkness. It wasn't a simple power outage, it felt deliberate, like being swallowed by a void. Panic simmered just beneath the surface as I fumbled for my phone. When the dim glow of its screen pierced the gloom, I caught a glimpse of Grandma's face etched with an expression I would never forget, fear layered beneath a mask of resignation. Suddenly, the front door creaked open, no wind outside, just sheer unnatural force. An icy dread pulled in my stomach, and in the dim light streaming through, figures stood silhouetted against the doorway, not people, but tall, lead shapes, eyes glinting with otherworldly light, blending with the shadows of the forest. They made no sound as they slipped into the house, weaving between us, untouched by the walls. The very air around us thickened with an ancient power, reeking of the forest's damp rot. My grandma whispered something in a language soft and unfamiliar, her tone one of supplication or command, I couldn't be sure. But the figures paused, turning towards her as if understanding. For what felt like an eternity, time ceased its relentless march forward. And then, just as suddenly as they appeared, the silhouettes retreated into the night, leaving the door ajar, forest air mingling with the scent of our abandoned dinner. Light blinked back to life as if it had never left, leaving only an unsettling stillness in its wake. My family sat frozen, utensils suspended mid-bite, trying to comprehend the inexplicable intrusion. Grandma finally broke the silence, her voice firm and even. "We upset the balance," she declared. "We deprived them of their due." I wanted to speak, to challenge the absurdity of it all, but words failed me. Logic had crumbled. The remnants of the dinner lay forgotten as we stumbled to the porch, the forest looming dark and unyielding. And there, at its edge, unmistakably new yet ancient all the same, stood a venerable oak, gnarled and grand, a sentinel showing gratitude, or perhaps a warning. This was a game without end, a balance never to be taken for granted. Our lineage was tied to this place, bound by invisible threads spun long before us. The lesson burrowed deep beneath our skin, a reminder that what resides in the eternal thicket respects neither disbelief nor disregard. That night, as I lay in bed, I knew with certainty that some promises must never be broken, and not all family dinners are meant for us alone. You know, it was the kind of night you don't even think much about it all until later on, the evening when your casual remark spirals into something much bigger and more sinister than you could have ever predicted. My boyfriend, Tom, had this tradition of making tacos every Tuesday, something he picked up from his late grandmother, so these weekly tacos had a significance beyond the standard Tex-Mex fare. So suffice it to say, when I offhandedly mentioned that the tacos tasted a bit off, I didn't anticipate the cascading series of events it would set into motion. It happened over dinner, the sort of typically mundane one where we'd chat about work and our future plans in the soft glow of candlelight. After a few bites, I noticed the meat tasted slightly different, a subtle tang that felt misplaced among the usual flavors. Tom watched me expectantly, waiting for my reaction as usual. I hesitated but told myself honesty was the best policy, so I blurted out, "I'm not sure what's different, baby, but these aren't quite up to the usual standard." His slight nod seemed accepting, the way he always took feedback with a calm demeanor. But something flickered in his eyes that night, an uneasy shift that I chose to ignore. The first indication that something was amiss came later that night as I was brushing my teeth. Behind me in the mirror, I caught sight of Tom just standing in the hallway, unmoving, his eyes fixed on me with an almost unnerving intensity. "Is everything all right?" I asked, mouth half full of foamy toothpaste. He didn't answer immediately, just continued to watch me with that odd expression before slipping back into the shadows without a word. I should have been more concerned, but there was a rational part of my brain that quickly dismissed it as one of those late-night zombie states we all wander into from time to time. The next morning, however, I found the kitchen in an unexpected state of disarray, the counters cluttered with various ingredients, half-used spices, and a sticky residue coating every surface. At first, I thought maybe Tom had needed to recreate the tacos to perfect them. He was a bit of a culinary perfectionist that way, but when I saw him later, he acted as if nothing was out of the ordinary, chatting away about his day while completely sidestepping any mention of the previous night's culinary debacle or the early morning mess. As the week dragged on, Tom's behavior grew more peculiar with each passing day. He'd become painstaking in his kitchen activities, spending hours behind closed doors, where I could hear the rhythmic chopping of knives and the sizzling of pans interspersed with whirring blenders. Sometimes I'd step into the kitchen only to be gently, but firmly, ushered away, Tom insisting he wanted to surprise me with his latest creations. But every meal that followed was exactly the same: tacos, tacos, and more tacos, each plate more elaborate and garnished than the last, yet there was always an undercurrent of that strange, unidentified flavor that seemed to grow more pronounced after each iteration. I should have felt spoiled by the attention, but his fixation was beginning to unsettle me. When I returned home one particularly dreary Thursday evening, I noticed Tom had disappeared somewhere. His car was absent from the driveway. It was unlike him to leave without a word, so I began to search the house. Eventually, I ventured into the basement, a place I usually avoided due to its labyrinthine clutter of stored memories and unfinished projects. The air was cooler there, tinged with that distinct earthy smell of old wood and forgotten things. As I navigated through boxes and miscellaneous objects, I stumbled upon a disturbing scene: a small makeshift kitchen setup, a fold-up table cluttered with various herbs unfamiliar to me, some with colors so deep and strange they almost looked extraterrestrial. What truly caught my attention, though, were the notebooks, pages upon pages of notes scribbled in Tom's hasty scrawl, detailing each meal he'd made and various experiments in search of the perfect recipe. But much of the text was incoherent, filled with symbols and a language I couldn't understand, peppered with drawings that looked like twisted, nightmarish versions of kitchenware. In hindsight, I should have backed out right there and then, but curiosity mixed with an unsettling dread propelled me further into investigating. That night, as Tom slept beside me, seemingly blissfully unaware, I couldn't shake the visceral feeling of unease that clung to me like a heavy fog. My dreams were harrowing and filled with images of those twisted drawings come to life, creatures constructed out of utensils and flesh, writhing and advancing towards me in a distorted rhythm that followed the beating of my own heart. When I woke, drenched in a cold sweat, I found Tom absent once more, the space beside me still warm, indicating he'd only recently risen. It became clear I needed answers. Every instinct screamed that something was deeply wrong with this once charming, taciturn man I thought I knew. Delving into his personal belongings was not my proudest moment, but I needed to understand. Hidden at the back of his wardrobe, beneath piles of clothes he rarely wore, I found the final document, an old, leather-bound journal that looked much older than anything Tom should possess. The journal belonged not to Tom, but to his grandmother, the one whose legacy inspired Taco Tuesdays in the first place. Her handwriting was a careful, sloping script that spoke of her love for her culinary crafts, until it twisted into an obsession eerily similar to Tom's escalating mania. There were references to places and people unknown to normal society, whispers of an ancient recipe once passed from chef to chef, all of whom ended up succumbing to its strange allure. There was a darkness attached to this heritage of culinary perfection, something that demanded more than just skill but an unnatural, sacrificial devotion. It dawned on me with horror that ever since my small critique, Tom had been pulled into the same spiraling madness that had claimed his grandmother. They were all searching for that elusive taste, a taste of something forbidden and inescapable. I was caught in a paralyzing maze of decisions when I heard the door click open and shut, Tom's shadow lengthening along our hallway walls as he returned. I knew I couldn't confront him, not when he was embroiled in something none of us fully understood. So feigning ignorance, I placed the journal back where I'd found it, and over the next few days, quietly made my preparations to leave. It wasn't easy, the love I'd felt was genuine, but everything about our life now felt tainted by his pursuit of perfection, a phantom that lurked just beyond the borders of reason and logic. The day I finally walked out, I left a note behind, urging him in the only words I could think of to find his way back, away from the all-consuming hunger for something impossible and inherently destructive. That was weeks ago, and now I sit here writing this with mixed feelings of relief and sadness. Occasionally, I hear about Tom, snippets passed along by mutual friends who drop hints about his successes or resurgence with culinary fame. But I suspect underneath it all, the tacos he makes now brim with that same darkness, a personal concoction only he truly savors. Looking back, I often wonder if my honest critique had ignited what his grandmother's legacy started, or if, in truth, something far older and insidious had always resided in him, merely waiting for the chance to emerge. Grandma died with dignity at the age of 94 the other day, surrounded by her loved ones, or at least that's what the obituary said, how they praised her for her kindness and unwavering spirit in those last moments. But ever since her funeral, things have been wrong. It started innocuously enough. I was sorting through her belongings when I found a weathered journal tucked between the yellowed pages of an old book on herbal medicine. Flipping through its pages, I recognized her distinctive slanting handwriting, detailing vivid dreams and strange encounters that clouded her mind in those final years. That night, I tucked the journal beneath my pillow, thinking maybe I could glean some wisdom from her thoughts. But I was restless, tossing and turning, the air heavy with a stifling unease, when I was jolted awake by the unmistakable scent of lavender, Grandma's favorite fragrance. I opened my eyes, and there she was, at the foot of my bed, glowing softly, her face serene, yet unsettling with a hue more ethereal than human. I thought I was dreaming, but the weight of my racing heartbeat said otherwise, and as I blinked in disbelief, she whispered something that sent chills through my spine, "You have to help me." I could hardly breathe, this couldn't be real. I wanted this apparition to vanish, but instead, it felt as if she was pulling me into some ancient, familial obligation that tied us together beyond death. I fumbled for my phone, heart pounding, but the shadows played tricks on my mind, growing darker with her presence. I locked my eyes on her, desperately trying to comprehend. "You're not supposed to be here, Grandma," but she only stared back at me, her gaze piercing through the veil between life and the afterworld. "They don't understand," she urged, her voice like a thrum in my soul. "The shadows won't let me go." An icy fear gripped my heart, and I knew I wasn't just having a one-time spectral encounter, something was asking for help, and it was connected to her in ways I couldn't fathom. That night stretched into endless hours of speculation and dread, and when dawn finally broke, I resolved to figure out what she meant. I sought my mother, but she dismissed my haunting stories, burying them beneath layers of grief. Yet, a gut instinct told me to plunge deeper. If Grandma's spirit lingered, there had to be a reason. I returned to her journal, poring over it. The entries spoke of shadows not of this world, creatures that crossed paths with those on the brink of death, preying on their fears. As I read, an unshakable sense of dread settled in my chest. She wrote about an incident from long ago, how a neighbor's child went missing and was later found wandering in a daze, speaking of the whispers that called to him at night. Suddenly, the pieces fell into place. These shadows Grandma referenced could mean danger was still prowling around her, latching onto remnants of her being. They could be lying in wait for me. It was an awakening of generations past, and I had a feeling it was somehow my responsibility to stop whatever dark force encroached upon my family. Nights passed in torment as Grandma visited with increased frequency, her visage more sorrowful each time, her eyes pleading for liberation. I should have felt reassured to see her, but instead, I fell deeper into a pit of anguish, wrestling with the weight of her unfinished business. Then, late one night, the room fell unnaturally silent, and I felt a visceral jolt as something cold brushed against my arm. I shivered, heart racing, as I turned to see Grandma's face collapse into grim determination, the air thick with lingering dread. "Help me uncover the past, find the boy," she commanded, her voice echoing in the dark, "before they take you too." In a frenzied search of the town records, I unearthed old newspaper clippings about unsolved disappearances, tales I'd only ever heard whispered during family gatherings where Grandma's gaze would drift far away as if recalling dark memories. The missing children shared one eerie detail: they all lived in my neighborhood, and all around the same age. The chilling culmination of facts led me to the town's abandoned psychiatric hospital, crumbling and forgotten, long since closed for its sinister reputation. Overcome by a mixture of terror and intuition, I felt inexorably pulled toward the decaying building, clutching Grandma's journal like a talisman. The eerie silence swallowed me as I pushed the door open, air thick with neglect and the ghosts of past suffering. Wandering through the moldering halls, I glimpsed moth-eaten walls adorned with peeling paint, old whispers swirling through the air, a sense of urgency gnawing at me. That's when I stepped into what appeared to be an old therapy room and felt a chill wash over me, accompanied by the faint laughter of children, echoing through the abandoned space, tinged with despair. My breath caught. There were remnants of playing cards scattered on the floor, and as I knelt to pick one up, I froze upon seeing a name written on the back, a name that had been missing for decades: Samuel. My heart thundered. I realized that the dark shadows Grandma warned me about were tethered to these lost souls, forever seeking replacements, feeding off the energy of the living. Just then, the room darkened as a shadow slithered from the corners, coiling around my ankles, a sinister whisper taunting, "You're just like the others." I shrieked, trying to will the darkness away, but the room warped as shadows swirled around me, and in that chaos, I could see Grandma's face, a furious gentleness, the love fierce enough to push back against the malevolence closing in. I felt her essence, urging me, and against my fear, I shouted Samuel's name, echoing the desperation I felt for him, for Grandma, for myself. The shadows recoiled as her energy surged, and I began to see the outline of more faces, trapped but yearning for freedom. As I yelled, their grasp weakened, Grandma's spirit becoming a radiant force, illuminating the dark corners of the room, and together, we fought through the oppressive weight of despair, loosening the tight clutches of fear that bound these lost children. I realized then that her return was a battle cry against despair, that here, in this moment, she had opened a door not only for herself but for all who had suffered at the hands of the darkness. Finally, as the first light of dawn seeped through the cracked windows, the shadows eased their hold, and I watched as Grandma lifted her chin, her expression a profound mixture of love and grief. "Thank you," she breathed, and with that, she dissolved into a shower of light, leaving behind a lingering sense of warmth that enveloped me like a hug. The room trembled but began to feel lighter, and as I emerged from the haunted building, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders, the knowledge that some battles transcend life itself. I stepped into the light of a new day, knowing that I had not only freed Grandma but perhaps Samuel too, and whatever dark forces that lurked, I was ready to confront them, cherishing the truth that love is a binding force that even death cannot sever. I never expected to encounter something unimaginable at the yoga studio, a place of peace and tranquility for most of us. The Tuesday evening class was always packed, filled with people looking to unwind after a long day. As the instructor, it was my duty to ensure everyone was comfortable and had enough space to practice without disturbance. That's why it caught my attention when an unfamiliar woman walked in, eyes scanning for a spot. I noticed she paused when she saw an empty mat space in the back corner, an area many avoided, not due to lack of space, but because of an eerie incident a few months back. A regular student, Alex, passed away suddenly during a session, and it left an unsettling vibe in that particular spot. Most of the class still whispered about it, convinced that Alex never truly left us. When the newcomer laid her mat down in that space, a chill rushed down my spine. I never felt anything supernatural, just an odd tension in that spot, a sense of heaviness in the air. As I began class, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. My mind told me to ask her to move, a whisper of paranoia, perhaps, or a genuine gut feeling. But then again, what would I say? "Excuse me, could you move because some people think this place is haunted?" Would surely make me seem ridiculous, and perhaps she was someone who didn't believe in such things. Determined to focus, I initiated the session. The usual rhythm of focused breathing and gentle stretching commenced, but my attention kept drifting back to her. She seemed offbeat, as if she wasn't entirely present, or maybe she merely had her own sequence. My concern for disturbing the class balance warred with my curiosity, and a strange anxiety continued to brim beneath my professional demeanor. Soon, as we transitioned into more complex poses, the lights began flickering, throwing unsettling shadows along the walls. I heard gasps, students faltering mid-pose as the strobes of light created an uncanny, almost ethereal atmosphere, casting warped versions of us along the reflective studio mirrors. Then came the whispers, echoing quietly at first, rising like an imperceptible background frequency, words I couldn't distinguish. Everyone else seemed focused, unfazed, their faces serene masks, but when I glanced back at her, the new woman seemed transfixed, staring fixedly at her own reflection, as if in a trance. I knew I should end it there, break the spell of unease that tightened around us, but it was as though words lodged in my throat, paralyzed. Time warped into an infinite stretch, and within that warped instant, I saw her reflection change. It shifted subtly, facial features morphing, the eye sockets deepening, cheekbones growing sharper. It looked like Alex. Involuntarily, I took a step back, feeling a palpable force radiate from her, a gravitational pull of fear that clamped down on my heart. When she finally turned toward me, still in her spot, the flickering lights ceased, leaving only the dim ambience of the evening studio. The atmosphere felt lighter, as if waking from a shared nightmare, and the class continued, albeit with a muted tension. As I closed the session, hesitant eyes hovered over me, waiting for my explanation or perhaps seeking reassurance that everything was fine, yet I offered none. The woman approached me, smile benign but eyes knowing as if she had discovered an unspoken secret. "Thank you for the class," she said softly, walking past. In that fleeting moment, a cold breeze entered the studio, rustling the mats, a reminder, perhaps, that some boundaries should not be displaced, that some spaces were meant to be left undisturbed. But the haunting question, one I dared not voice aloud, lingered. Had Alex truly returned, or had I become a lingering specter of my own irrational fears? When I reached for my phone later, I instinctively typed a message intended for no one in particular, seeking absolution for letting a mystery remain unsolved in the shadowy folds of our everyday sanity, a mythasolida for not forcing this yoga student into a different mat spot. And as my fingers hesitated over the post button, a curious feeling, a knowing chill in the normally warm studio, suggested that sometimes, the mysteries we choose to leave untouched are the ones that silently watch us, waiting, from mirrors or the dim corners of our own reflections. The tension in my physics class had been building ever since our new teacher, Mr. Bryson, accidentally marked an incorrect question on our last quiz. It was one of those minor errors that teachers sometimes make, the kind they would routinely fix afterward, but not this time. Due to some glitch in his grading program, Mr. Bryson didn't notice the issue, and as fate would have it, the oversight allowed Jenny, the class genius, to bask in her first ever perfect score. It was all anyone talked about, how she celebrated by treating us to ice cream during lunch, how her parents even promised her a trip to Europe if she maintained the grades. I sat 2 rows behind her, haplessly aware that the question in error was glaringly incorrect. An awkward responsibility churned inside me. I had a knack for details, and overlooking things like this didn't sit right with me. I agonized for days, battling between the justice of truth and the humane appeal of not crushing Jenny's moment of triumph. Finally, my innate need for accuracy compelled me to approach Mr. Bryson after class. Telling him wasn't easy, my voice was a whisper, barely audible over the clattering sounds of departing students. His brow furrowed as I pointed out the error, and while his lips tightened into a thin line, his eyes conveyed reluctant acknowledgement. He thanked me for my honesty, and I left with my heart pounding. By the next day, an ominous cloud seemed to cast a shadow over the entire school. Word had spread like wildfire, albeit not accurately, as rumors twisted me into a villain who snatched away Jenny's dreams. I could almost feel the stares boring into my back in the hallways. The universe had a peculiar way of turning right into wrong, but this felt darker, conspiratorial. Even the weather seemed to echo the whispering animosity. Gray clouds hung low, the air damp with an impending downpour that added an eerie ambience to the unfolding drama. I tried avoiding eye contact, feeling the prickly sensation of being watched. Jenny hadn't been to school all morning. Word was, she had fallen sick. I felt queasier with each passing period. Then came the lunchtime confrontation in the absence of Jenny. Her groupies cornered me, their expressions a blend of accusation and bewilderment. They demanded a retraction or, at the very least, an apology. But could you truly apologize for seeking the truth? My mind reeled, desperate for a way to convey that I meant no harm, that the real struggle had been internal, and perhaps equally costly. As the day dragged into ominous twilight, the school seemed to shapeshift into something ancient and haunted. Whispers turned to ghostly echoes as unfamiliar chills ran down my spine when I walked past the art room. Was it my mind, heavy with guilt, playing on my imagination, or did the shadows in the corridor shift slightly when approached, as if retreating into their age-old refuge? My footsteps fell into a rhythm, one that seemed strangely synchronized with another set of steps, ones that halted when I did and resumed just a split second later, always lurking just behind me. I couldn't discern whether they belonged to a fellow classmate or an unseen force manifesting from the deeper layers of my subconscious guild. The bell finally heralded the day's end, but the dread that clung to me only thickened as I journeyed home. That night, As I lay in bed, trying to stave off the relentless anxiety, a notification pinged, a message from an unknown sender in my school's group chat. It was a video taken from a hallway security camera, grainy and cut, showing me speaking to Mr. Bryson after class. The caption read, "You can't hide from the truth." My stomach twisted, the universe seemed to conspire against me, or perhaps this was a test, a twisted check of moral integrity. Unable to sleep, I paced my dimly lit room. Shadows moved like liquid nightmares across my walls, and the restless wind outside pelting against my windows began to resemble an insistent tapping, a gentle prodding at the edge of my budding paranoia. I checked my messages again, only to discover it wasn't just a video. Now there were texts from classmates, some supportive, others vicious and laden with thinly veiled threats. My fading resolve slammed against a brick wall when I saw a message suggesting I had broken something fragile within Jenny, something not just academic. The next few days blurred into a cold repetition, each filled with not-so-subtle hostile glances and an overwhelming sense that something vital was changing in the fabric of my reality. The school didn't bother with the cookie-cutter complaints anymore. There was unspoken tension across classrooms, the kind you could almost touch. Jenny returned with shadowed eyes, her once vibrant presence now muted. Her silence was loud, an echoing indictment against me, and the day she approached me was when the last thread of normalcy snapped. It was during a free period. The basement library had an air of forgotten histories and secrets, perfect for studying unseen. But in that secluded corner, Jenny found me. Her voice, though directed at me, seemed to carry the weight of someone speaking from two dimensions, one real and the other burdened by a hidden, eerie realm. "I know you didn't mean harm," she began, her words like gentle rain, "but some truths are meant to stay buried." Her eyes, usually a calm brown, seemed now to harbor flickers of something unknowable, as if a deeper truth fought to surface. She spoke of dreams that turned to nightmares, of strange images, symbols that etched themselves into the walls of her mind, urging her to rewrite a cosmic wrong that neither of us could comprehend. "Some truths," she whispered, "unleash what shouldn't be disturbed." Her words left me shaken, battling an inexplicable force within my mind that told me she was right. That night, I dreamt of the school, its corridors stretching endlessly, filled with things unseen, whispering secrets no history should bear. The next morning, I awoke with a single thought stealing my clarity: perhaps some victories aren't meant to be achieved, and maybe my obsession with correction had ripped a fissure in an otherwise seamless world. At school, I sought Mr. Bryson, planning to convince him to let the matter fall back into obscurity. But his absence resonated as strange. Students mingled rumors of resignation, until it was announced he had abruptly transferred, the reasons shrouded in polite mystery. The air was charged with something unsaid, and as I wandered the silent halls once more, a realization unfolded. In my quest for righteousness, I had defied more than just human error. I had awakened something ancient, a lurking awareness within the very bones of the school. From then on, while the details of the quiz dilemma faded like a forgotten headline, an understanding took root in the secret corners of my consciousness. Some truths, once revealed, cannot coexist peacefully with our own fragile reality. I had always considered myself a person with common sense, but solitude in the wilderness under the guise of a refreshing retreat shredded that notion. The national park was supposed to be peaceful, an antidote to months of windowless cubicle life, where the closest I got to nature were potted plants begging for relief. I set out one early morning just as dawn fished through the pine trees, beads of dew bowing branches, the air crisply punctuated by distant bird calls. I aimed for a trail less traveled, thinking it poetic and perfectly eccentric until that fateful moment when my left foot sank with a sickening snap and the sharp, cruel jaws of a bear trap clamped around my leg. Pain, like liquid fire, spiked upwards as I fell, breath punched from my lungs, mingled with an animal scream I barely recognized as mine. Panicking, scrambling for my phone, I cursed my decision to go off-grid. No reception bars mocked me. It took all my strength to suppress the creeping dread and examine the trap tearing into my calves, a rusted contraption from another century, buried under foliage like a malignant predator. Tugging did nothing but drive the teeth deeper, the forest whispering, almost taunting my predicament. Hours passed, sky bruising into fearful purples and black, and the forest awoke in its nocturnal symphony, each crackle of a snapping twig amplified until it seized my heart in a vice grip. Then came the light, erratic beams swaying between trees, shadows slithering in their wake, and with it, the hushed footfalls. Relief surged briefly through the agony. Someone was here. A figure emerged, cloaked in a darkness that danced with the bobbing flashlight. But hope sputtered and fled when I caught sight of what they held, a hunting rifle cradled casually like an extension of their arm. This wasn't a ranger. My voice, increasingly hoarse, cut through. "Help. I'm stuck." Hoping to summon humanity from the dark silhouette. The man approached with a predator's patience, checking the sharp iron, and then gazing at me with unreadable eyes, marked by a solemn, almost reverent silence. "You shouldn't have come here." The voice finally dripped like tar, words dense and deliberate. Fear and confusion churned, God's forgotten woods and a lone man bedecked with danger and secrets. It struck me like a horror onset, the inescapable kind. My plea somersaulted into the void as he took a seat on a rotten log, inspecting the trap hungrily, like an achievement well earned. "It feeds on despair," he murmured, stroking the jagged metal like one would a cherished pet. Questions volleyed through my mind, irrationally unable to dislodge the absurdity of his words. "You're going to die," the hunter's voice intoned with grim certainty, "but you're mine to claim." Every bit of ancestral survival instinct bellowed to me as adrenaline wrestled with torment. Whatever deranged ritual this stranger had in mind, it was something I wouldn't, accept. Small talk and sanity clung by their fingernails to the bizarre calm I forced upon myself. I lied. I told him friends were on the way, hoping it would dissuade whatever plans boiled behind those inscrutable eyes. He simply laughed, low and guttural, dismissing the notion like a child's scattered dreams. His world devoid of mercy had no room for the nonsensical concept of rescue. Then, beneath my anguish-racked body, danced the creeping sensation of escape, a jagged rock half buried in the dirt. My time with that damn trap wasn't wasted. Flexing against the pain, I slowly worked to wedge it against the rusted iron. Minutes melted into centuries as the night deepened and the hunter's vigilance waned, indulging in the sick hospitality of a leisurely menace. Just as the subtle click of stone leverage whispered freedom, he rose, the silhouette's stance spelling finality. In one desperate, last-ditch gamble, I threw all my weight on the rock. A creak, the trap unfurling its metal maw just enough to wrest my bloodied limb free. Pain gouged its signature on every nerve as I bolted, adrenaline dulling the reality that every step was another drop closer to madness. Branches whipped at my face, the forest swallowing my ragged breath as panic-stripped plans flared and vanished in the dark. Behind me, his voice, the terror of his pursuit, thudded through twilight trees, closing in like ink spreading through clear waters. The world cinched with nightmare rhythm, my flight blind, driven by raw instinct unrefined by conscious thought until I skidded onto a larger trail. In the moon-drenched clearing laid Salvation, an abandoned ranger outpost, aged yet sturdy. Scrambling inside, I slammed the door, my heartbeat synchronized with the thunderous hammering against weakened wood. Shelved within were old flares and a radio begging for deliverance. Luck, that long-forgotten ally, gifted me faint static slowly transforming to coherent plea, my voice echoing into the ether, a lifeline cast through the void. Crack. The door shivered under assault, splintering in refusal to yield. I held the flare ready, my mind rupturing under the pressure of an eternal night distilled into mere moments. But then, the chest-thumping chorus of helicopters announced themselves, a revelation splintering terror's monologue. The hunter's silhouette hesitated, a flicker of something, a defeat, madness, the inconsolable loss of a twisted game, in his stance before shadows reclaimed him. Rescue descended in a cacophony of light and sound, the authorities unspooling questions I couldn't answer as they bundled me into safety's embrace. Now, grounded in a hospital where the mundane monotony of ceiling tiles provides a certain comfort, questions coil around me like shadows. Who was that man, and what ritual did those woods demand? The painkillers blur the line between memory and dream, yet I know one night, I may see his spectre looming at the end of my bed, eyes brimming with the promise of stories left untold, of an absurd, dark hunt forest could never quite devour. But even amidst this fear, a thought persists, a chilling, burgeoning premonition. Would the bear trap remain, teeth blistered and waiting, for someone else unsuspecting to step into its hellish story? I never thought I'd be labeled an asshole, especially not on a platform like a myth asshole, but sometimes life throws you into situations that seem so surreal, so twisted that even you can't believe what you've done. It all started with a phone call late one night. My fiancée, Jamie, was sobbing on the other end, her voice cracking as she told me that her mother had passed away unexpectedly. My gut twisted as I listened to her, the heartache flooding through the line, but as the shock wore off, reality began to sink in. Jamie's mom had always been a difficult person, and our relationship had been strained at best. We would clash every time we met, her barbed comments making laughter feel like a competition of sorts, her judgmental eyes like daggers that cut through the pretense of family gatherings. Yet, no matter how hard I tried to avoid conflict, her presence loomed over our relationship like a suffocating cloud. Jamie had always felt torn between love for her mother and the discomfort her mother brought into our lives, and now, standing in the shadow of grief, those old resentments resurfaced. When Jamie asked me how we would pay for the funeral, I hesitated. I remember the moment clearly, the noise of our living room, the smell of the takeout I had just brought back to celebrate an engagement that now felt devoid of joy. There was something about the way she said it, the expectation in her voice, and for a split second, I thought about our finances, our future. I hesitated, weighing the memories of her mother's nasty remarks against the guilt that already crept in like a thief in the night. "I'm sorry, but my own family has debt. I can't afford to pay for someone who never respected me," I finally said, and the silence that followed was deafening. It felt like I had just announced an apocalypse, the end of a world that I had poured everything into. I thought Jamie might understand, I thought she would at least appreciate my honesty. But the call spiraled downhill. While I had imagined her crying because of grief, her wails now sounded like a wild animal caught in a trap, shrill and devastating, and hearing her pain was like plunging a knife deeper into my own gut. She hung up on me, and for days, the silence between us grew heavier, thicker like the fog that rolls through our sleepy town. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Jamie's face contorted with betrayal, her mother's sneering visage hovering in the background like a specter. Our wedding plans began to unravel, mutual friends nervously tiptoed around the subject, neither of us brave enough to bring up the blame that now tainted our love. The funeral came, and I didn't go. I spent the day locked in our apartment, drowning myself in video games and social media, scrolling through posts until my brain turned numb. When I finally summoned the courage to reach out to Jamie, there was no response, just a collection of cold, unsettling echoing voices from our past families, tearing at the seams. It was only a few days later that I received the invitation to a different gathering, a dinner at Jamie's aunt's house. Her family was gathering to remember her late mother, and I felt a tide of emotions rise again: guilt, dread, and the painful dullness of regret. Despite everything, I showed up, hoping maybe I could salvage what was left of our engagement, but what was waiting for me was a scene from a horror flick. Jamie was there, and the icy looks from her relatives could have frozen the flames of hell itself. "You," her aunt snarled, "you're the reason Jamie's heartbroken, the reason she's lost her way." That single sentence slammed down on me like a tombstone. The last spark of hope fizzled out as family members chimed in, airing their grievances. They painted me as the villain, the man who had turned his back on a grieving widow. It felt surreal, like I was being dragged into a dark theater where I wasn't even a star of the show. The audience shared whispers, murmurs that turned into a cacophony, and in that moment, I realized I was trapped in a nightmare of my own making. I tried to explain my position, but each word only fueled their outrage, the storm of judgment crashing onto my shoulders. And it was at that moment, as Jamie turned her face from me, that I felt a sense of icy clarity. She wasn't angry at me for refusing to pay, she was furious because she was caught between her loyalty to her mother's memory and us. I wanted to run, to escape the scrutiny and the suffocating despair that was threatening to swallow me whole. That night, I typed my story on a myth asshole, looking for some reflection, a glimmer of shared experience, expecting to find sympathy. Instead, it was like igniting a fuse leading to chaos, an avalanche of comments tearing me apart, judging every word I had shared, laying bare my soul for everyone to spit on. "If you don't care about your fiancé's grief, you're the asshole," one user wrote, and I felt the heaviness of despair wrap around me again, each notification bullying me like a gang of hyenas feasting on a carcass. The post went viral, tearing through the comment sections like wildfire, opinions flying from every direction, and before I knew it, I was battling trolls online who veiled their vitriol beneath the guise of concern. The next morning, I woke up to a storm. My phone was alive with allegations, insults, people accusing me of being heartless. It was like each notification was a stab, each comment a reminder of how I had failed. Jamie called later that day, and while her voice quaked with emotion, I felt nothing but numbness creeping through the hollow shell I had become. She didn't say much, hardly spoke at all, but the silence was rife with an unspoken truth that haunted me deeply. I had lost her, and there was nothing I could do to change that. She informed me that her family would take care of everything and that she didn't want to have anything to do with someone who couldn't understand the core of family, grief, and support. The call ended, and with it, any thread of hope I had clung to for dear life unraveled before my eyes. I sat there, alone in a sea of my own desolation, staring at the notifications that seemed to mock me, reading over and over the comments that encapsulated my nightmare. Days blurred into weeks, I still find myself contemplating those moments regularly, as if they flicker like a film reel in my mind. Did I handle it poorly? Am I actually the asshole in this story? Yet what haunts me the most is that lingering thought: how could a simple decision, one rooted in financial reality, turn into something so irrevocably tragic? Now, as life unfurls like a tattered scroll of unforgiving memories, the one certainty that remains is that I can't find a way to forgive myself. Maybe I never will. When I initially agreed to participate in that ill-fated hot dog eating contest, I truly believed it would be a lighthearted way to bond with my girlfriend Sarah's dad, Bruce, a middle-aged man with a notorious appetite and a fierce competitive streak, someone who probably thought eating contests was just another word for family tradition. The event took place at a local fair filled with families and laughter, but the air felt charged with a palpable tension as we both sat at the long table, surrounded by dozens of eager contestants. I could hear the announcer's voice booming over the loudspeakers, but all I could focus on was Bruce's intense gaze, full of the unspoken challenge. He was well known in our town for his impressive array of competitive eating trophies, and I couldn't help but feel a wave of anxiety wash over me as the fluffy buns stared back at me like fluffy, white harbingers of doom. The contest kicked off with a blast of the horn, and for the first few minutes, everything was hilarious. I was laughing, waving to Sarah and the family, the giant brackets of mustard and ketchup like a toddler's finger painting. But it didn't take long for my stomach to turn as Bruce, like a man possessed, started shoving those innocent hot dogs down his throat with alarming speed, the sheer grotesque audacity draining the joy from the air. Each swallow looked like an Olympic feat, his face contorting oddly. Was that some sort of grin or a grimace? I tried to pace myself, yet an overwhelming feeling of determination surged within me. I was not here just to bond, but to prove myself. As the minutes pressed on and the crowd cheered, I felt the pressure, the mounting expectation of everyone watching, my own gut in rebellion but ignoring all sensible warnings, pushing forward like I was carving my own destiny. For every dog I ingested, I could feel Bruce's confidence crack beneath the surface, and the delicious thrill of competition overtook the initial horror as my fingers began to curl around the next soggy bun. With one last push, I shoved the last hot dog into my mouth. Time stopped. The announcer's voice disappeared into a dull roar, and all I could think about was the fact that I'd won. As the final seconds ticked away, the crowd erupted into cheers, and I shot Bruce a confident, triumphant grin, only to see the color drain from his face as he clutched his chest. He fell to the ground before I could process the victory, his body spasming as the paramedics rushed in. The joy transformed into a suffocating chaos, and the bubbly laughter of the crowd morphed into horrified screams. I stood there, paralyzed, my victory taste soured and overshadowed by panic. I hadn't just beaten Bruce, I had quite literally left him gasping for air. The ensuing weeks felt like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from, even after the doctors assured us that Bruce would be fine, suffering only from a severe bout of indigestion. Sarah, however, couldn't see the silver lining. Her eyes clouded with anger and betrayal mixed with disappointment. She could barely look at me without the cloud of judgment hovering above us. Now I was guilty, and the tiny whispers on social media, "Am I the asshole?" felt like a malevolent shadow curling around my mind. I'd initially brushed off those thoughts, wanting to understand the severity of my actions, but each moment was a needle in my conscience. "You should have let him win," people remarked, like I had unwittingly upset the cosmic order of family bonds. The rift between Sarah and me stretched thin, even more venomous as time pulled the thread taut, and I was left isolated in the remnants of my festive blunder. I desperately scrolled through forums, drowning myself in conflicting opinions, from those who condemned me as a villain sliding through the cracks of society, to the odd voices that saw my determination as commendable, even romantic. It clawed at my sense of self. Was I just a predator in a game made for innocent fun? My own parents started to worry, asking about my state of mind, and all I could think about were those damn hot dogs, their contemptible strength over me. I tried to apologize to Bruce, but when I stepped into their home, the atmosphere turned frigid. I was a stranger in their family, and he shot me a look that could pierce steel, filled with layers of resentment I had never anticipated. The weight of guilt settled heavily on my shoulders as I left, uncertain if I had irreparably damaged a relationship that had once felt so promising. Days turned to weeks, each one dragging me deeper into despair, feeling as if I had stepped into a cursed mirror reality where my every move echoed louder with judgment. Arguments spilled into every corner of my life as I became a walking ghost, enveloped in the aftermath of my triumph, until one fateful evening, I received a message from Sarah, her cold tone contrasting sharply with the love we once shared. "You're not the man I thought you were?" My heart sank into an abyss where light could not penetrate, and in that moment, I understood. No wins in contests matter if you lose the people you love. I ended up leaving town, Trying to outrun both their shadows and the chill of that day, I changed my number, even created a new social media account where I could live anonymously, diving deep into work, suppressing the memories of Bruce and my loss until there was nothing left. But soon, an unsettling feeling began to creep back with every shared moment over hot dogs and laughter that I was somehow still haunting others. My old friends would casually refer back with a glint of humor, recounting the infamous contest story as if it was a badge of honor, and each chuckle felt like a betrayal against Sarah. That lingering guilt became a malignant growth, festering silently while the world remained oblivious to my turmoil. Some nights, I could swear I felt the weight of Bruce's gaze on me, the ghost of that moment lingering, pulling me back into a cycle of resentment. Then, one chilling evening, as I stalked through a late-night diner, I found myself at the counter. A hot dog sat waiting, sinfully inviting. I felt the eyes of the staff on me, the air thickening as it dawned on me that I could never escape who I had become. I picked it up, turning it in my hand. Could I even find humor in this anymore? As I took that first bite, images of Bruce flashed in my mind, not as an antagonist but as a man who had simply loved too fiercely. For every chew, for every swallow, an irrational fear crawled up my spine, almost expecting the room to go silent, faces turning in unison, all those conversations replayed in my mind. What if Bruce somehow knew? In that twisted moment, I couldn't tell whether I was filled with rage at myself or simply nostalgia for a life I no longer grasped. But I no longer cared, powering through until my stomach turned with regret. I abandoned the rest of the hot dog, half-eaten, burdened with a piece of my soul, promising myself I would never allow such a stupid contest to devour another relationship again. But deep down, a nagging question echoed, am I the asshole? Perhaps I could never escape the ghost of that competition, and maybe, just maybe, the real contest was the battle with the echoes of my decisions, the one that I stood to lose. Growing up, my childhood was punctuated by a peculiar kind of silence, one shadowed by the unspoken, secreted away into the dust-laden corners of my old Victorian family home. My parents were the kind who adhered to peculiar traditions and enigmatic rules, the strictest of which was, never explore the attic, and certainly never speak of what's inside. As a child, my curiosity was a feral beast, caged only by the loving yet stern assurances of my parents that there was nothing but old furniture and cobwebs, the living quarters for spiders and forgotten things. For the longest time, I abided by this rule. The keys to the attic remained hung on a silver chain worn perpetually around my father's neck, jangling with every step he took as if serving a constant reminder of the forbidden. Yet, the mysteries of childhood are rarely laid to rest with simple assurances, and there were nights when strange noises would filter down through the plaster, elusive whispers and delicate thuds that seemed too deliberate to be merely the house settling. I'd mention them casually during dinner, always receiving a dismissive chuckle from my parents, who would exchange knowing glances, their eyes clouding just for a fraction of a second, a fleeting moment of something I couldn't decipher then. As I grew older, the happenings took on a new form, less like curious noises and more like soft footsteps above my ceiling, sometimes growing frantic as if dozens of feet joined in an echoing dance. The nights when I was alone were the worst, each creak feeling like a herald of some unseen presence. Despite the mounting dread, my parents' rule held an ironclad grip on my tongue and my actions, for they were good people, kind and thoughtful in every way that counted, except this one, perplexing exception. It was only when I turned 17 that my life, and the secrets of my attic, unfolded in a way that shook the very core of my understanding of family. My parents had gone out for the evening, leaving me with the kind of nervous anticipation that comes only from the promise of solitary freedom in a house so full of mysteries. As the clouds rolled in and the evening grew into night, I finally gathered the courage, perhaps triggered by the desperate resound of the most violent footsteps yet, that seemed to shake the very walls. The keys had been left on the dining table, their steel glinting under the overhead light like a siren's call. With trembling hands, I took them, each step up the narrow staircase a test of my resolve. The door was heavy as if weighted down by more than just old memories, and its hinges protested when I forced it open. The space within was larger than I had imagined, a cavernous maw leaking the scent of dust and age, but it was the cool breeze brushing across my skin that unsettled me the most. There, amid the disorderly remnants of another century, stood three figures, pale and gaunt with eyes that mirrored mine, a sinister kinship that struck me immediately. They beckoned me with desperate eyes, their voices a tangled whisper that spoke directly to the marrow of my soul, claiming kinship yet unknown to me. "We're your brothers," one said, regret woven deeply into every syllable. And as the truth unfurled, my mind reeled with the implications. Hidden away by necessity or fear, my parents had kept these siblings concealed, tethered to the anonymity of the attic's shadows due to reasons yet unclear. Their story was a puzzle, fragmented but given color by their insistent claims of love and neglect, kindness and betrayal, a picture painted with the brushstrokes of secret lives. I wanted to embrace them, these spectral parts of my own history, but a chilling realization clawed at my subconscious: if they were secreted away, what did my parents fear? My thoughts tangled and danced with their whispers as they recounted tales of attempts to leave, of unseen threats and grim familial duties, their pleas bleeding into my consciousness like ink in water. The attic's presence was alive around us, pressing in with memories and the weight of secrets too monstrous to comprehend. The deeper they drew me into their reality, the more the boundaries blurred between safety and suffocation, family and foe, echoes of promises and betrayals etched into the very bones of the house. And then, as if triggered by my revelation, the house emitted a deep groan, the sudden fury of a life reaching its cataclysm. I was thrust back through the doorway in a panicked whirlwind, my fingers losing the grip on truths I'd only just begun to uncover. By some misfortunate mercy, the door slammed shut with a finality that resonated in my bones, trapping the reality of my secret siblings back in the sepulchral confines of the attic's embrace. The key fell from my grasp, bouncing once before resting in silence, a sentinel in its inaction. The truth of my family lay barred behind a door now stronger than iron, my voice, my resolve sealed in the prison of my heart by the unwavering declarations of love from parents who understood more than they'd ever let slip, their choices a contradiction of protection and punishment. From that night on, my home became simply a house, a structure of conflicted histories and hidden truths. My once secure world inverted, leaving me to navigate a minefield of secrets I was never meant to discover. My parents, when questioned, offered only quiet tears and trembling apologies, gestures weighted with more emotion than silence should hold. Our family dinners grew quieter, the clinking of silverware muted percussion against the ghosts we all knew lingered just beyond the ceiling. Each day, the attic loomed larger in its power, a towering testament to the fragility of truth. My secret siblings remained a whisper in the recesses of my mind, their existence a haunting cadence, a promise unfulfilled. And though my tongue remained bound by the unspeakable pact of our family's history, I carried their stories, their faces, indistinguishable from mine, locked away behind eyes that once looked at the world with innocence but now see it as it truly is, a tapestry woven with secrets, far too dire to be unraveled. Growing up, I was always the skinny kid, tall and lanky with little muscle. I ate whatever I wanted without a second thought, and it never seemed to stick to me, until one particular summer changed everything. It all started when I stumbled across an unmarked package on the doorstep, the cardboard all weathered and stained, and curiosity got the best of me. I ripped it open and inside was a dusty old book titled The Keening Ritual, its cover fading and frayed, filled with bizarre recipes that claimed to summon otherworldly entities. Among the pages were strange illustrations of food with unsettling faces, and although I didn't believe in the supernatural, a dare ignited within me, fueled by boredom and an overwhelming desire to escape the mundane rhythm of life. I gathered the strange ingredients listed in the book, which involved rummaging through farmers' markets for oddities like ghost peppers and sage, and crafted the first dish, a twisted soup that, when consumed, filled me with warmth and an almost euphoric high I had never experienced before. It started innocently enough. I felt more alive, energetic, and I reveled in this newfound passion for cooking these otherworldly recipes day after day. But then things began to change. Friends noticed how my skinny frame was slowly filling out, convinced I'd finally hit puberty late, but it was more than that. I began inviting them over to share my creations, luring them into this bizarre culinary adventure, and it became a ritual, friends pairing the meals with laughter and stories, blissful and unaware of the shift occurring beneath the surface. I found myself obsessed with the book, experimenting with the most macabre recipes that began to yield lost promises. Each plate was both a delight and a warning. My dreams soon became haunted by visions of those twisted, smiling faces illustrated in the book, emerging from the shadows each night, as if they were awake and hungry, demanding more. I thought I could control it, that I just needed moderation, but as the days turned into weeks, I was drawn deeper into the chaotic gravity of my culinary exploits. My friends started to disappear from gatherings, their laughter fading into whispered concerns about their growing girth. They claimed they felt sluggish, weighed down, but I merely laughed it off as a natural consequence of summer indulgence, never once connecting the dietary dots. By autumn, I found myself standing in front of a mirror, eyes widening in shock at the reflection staring back. I had transformed completely, the once lanky boy barely recognizable under the waves of soft flesh blotting my once defined features. Each day passed in a gray fog of defiance and denial, the fervor of cooking overshadowing any concerns about my health or my friend's notable absence. My own descent turned into a spiral, an insatiable hunger fusing with sincerity. I could not stop myself. Each recipe unlocked a deeper level of obsession, and soon my income was gutted from online deliveries of increasingly exotic and untraceable ingredients. It became clearer to me that something was very wrong, yet I was willing to ignore it, watching with horror as the scale crept higher and higher, numbers that cruelly mocked me, weight that had replaced laughter and sincerity, followed by whispers that lingered in my head, "Feed us. Feed us." Until one fateful night, exhausted and desperate for a taste of creativity, I flipped to the book's last pages, where a sinister suggestion lingered, an ancient rite that promised deeper connection with the entities I had summoned, urging me to feed them directly. At that moment, something snapped inside me. I gathered my courage, preparing to execute the final ritual in the golden hour light, the recipe so convoluted and grotesque it chilled me to the bone yet thrilled me all the same. I followed the instructions meticulously, including an expendable ingredient, a single ounce of human flesh, something that chilled my veins, but I had lost my mind to the whispers, the wild hunger that had crescendoed within my body, and after mumbling those words, something unfathomable gripped me tightly, wrapping around my insides as I knew I was now everything they wanted. When sunrise broke, my body was drained, a ghastly silence filled the air as I stumbled towards the mirror, trepidation licking at my heels. I glanced in and gasped. I was no longer alone. Twisted smiles mirrored my own, grotesque figures stood behind me, and I felt their weight, a weight that grew with every bite. I fought against it, but the struggle was futile. Friends' faces filled my mind, their laughter replaced by wails and agony, and it was then I realized that the weight I had gained wasn't merely physical, it was their collective sorrow, their pain seeping into my presence for every meal I had created, memories bubbling just below the surface. And as I stood there, haunted and trembling, I knew the true price of my indulgence, my soul forever feasting on the essence of those I had loved and lost, chained by gluttony to an insatiable hunger for more, now forever enslaved to the sentient whispers inside the dust-laden pages of that accursed book, each meal ushering not satisfaction, but an unending craving that could never be sated. When we signed up for Camp Alderwood, the brochure promised adventure, friendship, and memories to last a lifetime. Nestled deep in the untouched forests of Vermont, the camp boasted an expansive lake, rustic cabins, and an escape from the electronic world most of us craved. Our parents saw it as a perfect getaway from our screens, a chance to reconnect with nature, as my mom enthusiastically put it. With a small group of friends, I boarded the rickety bus that would carry us and a dozen other kids into what we thought was going to be a summer of fun and exploration. For the first few days, the camp was exactly what we'd envisioned. We spent mornings perfecting our archery skills, not that I was any good, evenings by the campfire sending s'mores sliding into our stomachs, and afternoons swimming in the glistening lake, whose depths seemed endless and oh so inviting under the sun's watery gaze. Our counselors, especially Mark and Jess, were cool, and stories of their college adventures made them seem older and wiser than their mere 7-year seniority over us should have justified. But even the best of stories have their shadows, and it was on the midnight of our 5th day that the idyllic facade began to peel back. The first inkling of something wrong came when Ella, a girl from the cabin next to mine, went missing after a night hike led by another counselor, Gwen. At first, they told us she must have just gotten lost, but something about the way Gwen's voice quivered while reporting the incident struck me as off. Ella's parents were informed, or so we were told, and yet no police showed up, no search parties apart from us hapless kids were organized, and the incident was brushed off far more easily than seemed appropriate. Then came the second disappearance. Daniel, one of my closer friends, failed to return from a solo canoe trip 3 days later. Unease settled over the camp like an unwanted chill, whispers of campfire stories turned dark with anxious reality. We were assured everything was under control, to stick together, and stay within the marked areas of the campground. But one night, as the quiet tension swelled, Tom, the jokester of our crew, whispered what we all feared: what if we weren't the only ones being hunted? Curiosity overtook fear as we started piecing together the shreds of clues around us. It was Kali, the most resourceful among us, who discovered a weathered old map ducked behind a loose floorboard in our cabin. The map marked paths and clearings we didn't recognize from any hikes and was frayed with age, annotated with small, cryptic symbols. It hinted at hunts but didn't make sense until we stumbled upon a hidden door beneath the camp's toolshed, revealing a staircase into a dank basement outfitted with surveillance equipment aimed at our cabins and communal areas. The realization sank in heavy. Alderwood was a front, a hunting ground not for the wildlife we often heard rustling the canopy, but for people. Nauseating thrill of terror gripped our small group. We decided our only chance was to alert anyone outside of camp, easier said than done with our phones impounded for the duration of our stay, and most of the adults likely in on the grim secret. Kali, with nerves of steel, suggested we slip away during a strategic, chaotic moment when the counselors would least expect it. The camp was scheduled for an all-night scavenger hunt, a festive finale we wouldn't be rejoining as their prey. Our hearts throbbed like birds trapped in cages as the hunt began, players marked with brightly colored bands. We wore the neutrality of the watchful forest, slipping from tree to tree once the game was well underway, their laughter fading into background static. Beneath the cloak of midnight, the woods turned sinister, every branch a claw ready to snatch at us. We'd realized there were sensors and cameras, more than we could easily dodge, but not all their eyes could be everywhere. Kali led us to an overlooked trail that seemed to promise safety with its thorns and dense underbrush. We had little, apart from sheer adrenaline and the desperation to avoid becoming the next tale of a camper gone awry. Hours passed with painstaking quietude, our feet sore and our breaths short. Perpetually, the fear of pursuit rendered us silent, until finally, the vague buzz of chatter and car engines came as distant whispers through the trees. We stumbled upon the highway just as dawn's early light melted the horizon, silhouettes cast long from our exhausted bodies as travelers on the road began their daily routines, oblivious to the terror we'd left behind. A passing trucker eventually stopped, incredulous at our dirt-streaked faces, wide eyes, and breathy tail, liberally sown with emissions to retain our coherence. Help came quickly after that, the promise of a police presence, an investigation we might never truly know the outcome of, but relief enough that we'd crossed out of bounds of that hellish preserve. Looking back, it shames me to admit that even though I escaped, not all of us were so fortunate. Ella, Daniel, and who knows how many others remain unaccounted for. Their faces haunt my dreams, not for their lack of closure, but because I recognize that even today, places like Camp Alderwood might still exist, cleverly concealed as idyllic escapes, when in reality they serve another, darker purpose. I had always heard the stories, whispers from older friends and muffled giggles during sleepovers, about the wild, uninhibited experiences one could have in a steamy embrace of passion, the kind that left you breathless and craving more. This wasn't high school, this was adult life, or so I thought. And in my 24 years, I had built up a fantasy where sex was this intoxicating explosion of chemistry, where bodies merged and a spark of electricity coursed through the air, leaving behind a haze of lust and lingering smiles. But nothing prepared me for the night that would shatter that illusion. It started innocently enough with a chance encounter at a bar, an alluring stranger whose playful smile suggested a world of debauchery and adventure just waiting for me to dive in. We made eyes at each other across the crowded space, and after a few too many drinks, I felt that thrilling tug of attraction that had the world spinning around us. I remember he leaned in close, his breath hot against my ear as he whispered promises that ignited a fire deep within me, coaxing me to surrender to temptation. Somewhere in the back of my mind, a small voice cautioned me, this kind of excitement usually meant trouble, but overwhelmed by need, I shushed it into silence as we ended up at his apartment, my cheeks flushing under the dim lighting as I explored the contours of his body, unraveling each layer of clothing like it was a present waiting to be unwrapped. I could feel anticipation tickling my skin, and for a moment, I thought I was living the dream, that I would finally experience the kind of passion people raved about in hushed tones. But then it happened, the moment he leaned over me, tracing his fingers down my stomach, the joy bubbling up inside me suddenly stifled by an overwhelming sense of dread. For every whisper of his breath, every shiver that ran down my spine, I could hear another voice joining in. A cacophony of creeping thoughts that spiraled out of control, whispering unsettling reminders about vulnerability and unspoken desires that made me question everything. I don't know if it was the dim light exaggerating the shadows in the room or his smoldering gaze that was becoming increasingly intense, but my heart started racing not from arousal, but from an instinctual response that screamed something wasn't right. As he descended lower, the intoxicating fog of lust dissipated into something far more sinister, like a shroud of reality crashing into a fragile fantasy. I tried to shake it off, after all, this was what I wanted, wasn't it? But with each fleeting caress, the room seemed to darken, revealing unseen corners filled with doubt and anxiety. When he finally pressed against me, the heat of his body colliding with mine ignited everything I had anticipated, but it was all wrong. My skin prickled, not from pleasure but from an overwhelming sensation of being trapped, like I was merely an object in a scene I was no longer a part of. I gasped. Then held my breath, every rhythmic thrust echoing the horror of being too exposed. Was this what all the excitement was about? The promise of electric sensations became a hollow echo in my mind, drowning out the once familiar voice that whispered caution. I could feel the panic rising, making me question my sanity, the clock ticking in my head while every part of me shouted to stop and run until I was safely away, back in the comfort of my own solitude. But I didn't want to be the prude, the girl who couldn't handle it, so I clenched my eyes shut and tried to force back the tidal wave of worry flooding my senses. I told myself that this was just nerves, that every heartbeat resonating within me was the pulse of desire building to something magical, but deep down, I knew the truth. The moment froze, the sensation warped until I was utterly and irrevocably uncomfortable. As if sensing my distress, he paused, yet that was when the situation shifted. He locked eyes with me, and in that gaze, I saw something unholy, a sweeping darkness that made my blood run cold. It sent icy tendrils creeping up my spine, coiling tightly around my throat as I panicked, feeling the weight of his hunger. In those heartbreaking seconds, with my world teetering on the brink of chaos, I began to realize that sex didn't have the heightened allure I had imagined, but rather a hidden depth that could turn a once thought passionate encounter into something grotesquely sinister. My instincts screamed for survival, and with one last shred of courage, I shoved him away, scrambling off the bed, heart pounding painfully against my ribs, demanding I escape this surreal nightmare. I could feel every ounce of anticipation morphing into terror, blurring the lines of what was supposed to be intimate and what was merely predatory. He lunged forward, hands reaching for me, but in a blur of panic, I dashed toward the door, the taste of fear acidic on my tongue. I flung it open in desperation, fleeing into the night, the cool air of the world outside contrasting sharply with the chaos racing in my veins, igniting a desperation to keep moving until I was a safe distance away from that place, from him, from the haunting truth of disillusionment. I stumbled into the emptiness of the street and broke into a run, the excitement I once craved now a ghostly memory, recognition sinking in like lead. Sex wasn't what I thought it would be, the thrill I fantasized about was really just a facade masking the darker undercurrents that ran beneath it all. I learned then that the hottest experiences one might anticipate could also lead to the coldest, most frightening reality. That night bled into the next day, and each time I closed my eyes, a haunting reminder played through my mind, a trauma etched to never wash away. Sexual desire isn't always passion, it can just as easily warp into something monstrous, unveiling how quick the enthrallment can shift to fear, and how passion can become something to survive, not embrace. The stories I once shared with friends turned skeletal in their retelling, warnings warning about the edge of intimacy behind the allure, revealing the shadows lurking in the romantic explosions I had once hoped to ignite. I would forever cling to that lesson, a burden that turned joy into caution and glamour into dread, and now no longer could I pretend that the hype might be as intoxicating as I believed. Love became a tightrope act, passion a whisper of a danger, and it weighed on me like a constant shadow, a reminder that the thrills of adulthood came with their very own, very real fears. I never imagined my life spiraling into the chaos that I'm now drowning in, but here I am, writing this confession more as a farewell than a plea for help. My name is Jacob, a name I hope hasn't made it into too many police reports yet, but one that's undoubtedly known by a few shadowy figures in the dim back rooms of New York's underbelly. It all started innocently enough, a night of poker with friends on the Lower East Side, the gritty yet vibrant neighborhood that's home to more stories than anyone could recount in a lifetime. That night, I sat across from faces that didn't seem all that menacing at first, men in suits who generously bought rounds for the house, laughed too loud, and were either too interested in their cards or not at all, the kind of nonchalance that should have sent warning bells ringing in my inexperienced head. But the whirlwind of high-stakes betting was intoxicating, and I was too amazed by my own beginner's luck to notice the spiderweb I was spinning for myself. By the end of the night, I was up 20 grand, the smile plastered on my face as fake as the Rolex I wore. Sven, the lead guy, slicked back hair and eyes like a pit of snakes, clapped me on the back a little too hard, congratulating me with a grin that didn't reach the chill in his eyes. It wasn't long before a once-a-month poker game became a weekly ritual, promoted by Sven, who was always a little too generous with credit lines. I thought I was making friends, but I was sinking into the marsh without realizing it. The stakes got higher, the risks bigger, and before long, I owed more than I could imagine repaying. Sven's men, Marco and Luis, weren't exactly forthcoming about interest rates either. By the time I realized how deep I was in, the $20,000 I once won was dwarfed by a debt that seemed impossible to repay. That's when reality started taking a jagged edge, and I wished I could reset my life like one of those pinball machines when a ball gets stuck, except, here, I was the one who was stuck, and the machine was tilted out of my control. Every day after, Sven would remind me with a cheerful menace in his voice about the exposure I was under. Fail to pay, and I wouldn't just be cut off from the game, I'd be cut off permanently from daylight. I tried scraping money together, ignored the simmering panic in my gut that threatened to swallow me whole. But Sven wasn't fond of excuses. He had a reputation to maintain, after all, and he was very keen on reminding me that refusing to pay a business partner would skyrocket his costs, a downfall he wouldn't experience alone. A few persuasive visits later, my fingers taped up and nose bloodied, I knew they weren't just idle threats. Desperation does funny things to a man. It becomes a constant, almost physical companion. I took a second job bartending at a club that didn't ask questions, working myself to exhaustion trying to accumulate enough for a down payment at least. But saving was like trying to catch the tide with a colander, the urgency of Sven's ticking clock always one tick too fast. I considered running, changing my name, and heading to some nameless town in the Midwest. But I had no illusions. If they could find a man halfway across the globe, the prairies wouldn't hide me for long. One chilly evening, walking home under the fluorescent glow of street lamps, reality crashed in another layer deeper. A shadow detached itself from the corner, approaching with the kind of casual intent that screamed danger. Gabe. He was their enforcer, muscles on top of muscles, hands that could crush stones, and an uncanny ability to appear from nowhere. He didn't say much, just handed me a letter, Sven's seal imprinted ominously, and vanished back into the darkness from whence he came. My hands shook as I opened it, and the black ink might as well have been my own blood. 1 week left or the consequences would be more definitive, the letter said in that perfunctory tone that promised nothing good. With 97 hours and a ticking bomb hanging over my head, I did the unthinkable, I called the cops. Not looking for protection, I wasn't that naive, I knew better than to assume the cops could or would protect me from people like Sven. Instead, I thought maybe a sting or getting them involved would make Sven back off. But the officer who took my call seemed more interested in hints of collusion between me and the mafia than helping me. After a few probing questions, I realized I'd only dug myself deeper, painting a target not just on my back, but on my very life essence. The silence that followed the conversation was deafening, the realization that in trying to help myself, I'd only signed my fate's death warrant struck hard. I was out of time, out of options, yet in that darkest moment, clarity settled in. I had less than 4 days to engineer one last-ditch effort to escape. I started going through my contacts, unearthing fleeting acquaintances whose morality was as questionable as their sobriety. It was a gamble, but my whole life had become a pile of bets on bad horses. I reached out to Troy, a hacker I met once through mutual friends, one of those whose voice you hear but never really see. I promised him a hefty reward if he could ghost my identity, leave enough digital breadcrumbs to distract Sven and his cronies, and give me a day's head start, money I still didn't have but hoped to scrounge. Troy, intrigued by the chaos and perhaps sympathy wrapped in curiosity at my predicament, agreed. Miraculously, with Troy's digital wizardry, I managed to slip under their radar, at least temporarily. I liquidated what few assets I had, emptied my accounts into untraceable transactions, and slipped away in the dead of night, my heart pounding in rhythm to the city's cacophonous pulse. I left behind the person I was, Jacob, the fool, and embraced the hollow uncertainty of being no one. I stayed in the shadows, moving between cities, hostels, and the occasional sympathetic stranger or another like me, fugitives of our own making. I knew it couldn't last forever, that lurking just beyond the next dawn might be Gabe or one of Sven's men, the end of this game that had already gone on far too long. And as I write this, tucked away in another nameless room far from the bustling heart of the city that swallowed me whole, I realize I am the ghost of my own story, without conclusion, just an eternal echo lost in the corridors of time. Maybe, just maybe, the writing of this tale will free me, or damn me further, only time will tell. Our town, secluded by thick forests and shielded by jagged mountains, was never the sort of place you stumbled upon by accident. It was a close-knit community where everyone knew each other, where whispers of a birth or a funeral swiftly became public knowledge, shared between aisles in our solitary grocery store or across pews at Sunday church service. That's why it became all the more unnerving when they first appeared, unwanted visitors who never walked into the store, never spoke to us, unraveling an eerie presence by simply watching. We noticed them perched on low roofs, lurking under the eaves, or standing at the edges of our fields, their dark silhouettes blending into the twilight. There was something unnaturally calm about their poses, their faces always dimly lit by the glow from a street lamp or slanting moonlight. They would watch everything, from our children's clumsy soccer games to intimate family dinners glimpsed through undrawn curtains. Their eyes never wavered, tracing every step with a curiosity that felt predatory. At first, We tried to ignore them, laughing off their presence as a quirk of local teenagers, or perhaps drifters passing through. But then bizarre events began to unravel: a dog found lifeless near the road with no signs of injury, an elderly couple waking to find all their doors unlocked despite the deadbolt's clicks echoing in their memory. Things only got worse when my neighbor, Alice, a retired schoolteacher, claimed loudly at the town meeting that she had seen one of them up close, their face pale and eyes reflecting a deep emptiness like a black mirror. She described how she had felt her thoughts unravel, a déjà vu that rattled her until she found herself standing in her living room, hours lost, her cat hissing in the corner. The authorities were not much help, the sheriff contending it was all another migraine-induced nightmare, despite how our fear flickered into desperation. Swapping stories under the flickering street lamps, we found a pattern: the visitors, as we grudgingly called them, seemed drawn to places of memory, spots where our strongest emotions resided. That's what led Ethan, a local teen, to his unfathomable curiosity. He suggested they thrived on emotions, feeding off them like parasites. The thought sent chills skittering down my spine, especially after I found my husband standing at the kitchen sink, staring blankly into the backyard where one of them stood, his face terrifyingly serene despite the steam from the boiling pot burning his skin. On the night Ethan disappeared, a storm racked our town, raindrops blurring our windows. Lightning revealed their outlines clustered around the school, their numbers unnaturally multiplied. It felt as though they had finally found their feast. Panic prickled our minds, but leaving was unthinkable, as many had cars that refused to start, and others found the roads had become indistinguishable marshes. In a storm-soaked frenzy, we decided to confront them, emboldened by anger and helplessness, marching towards the school where they watched undaunted, their impervious eyes reflecting our desperation. But as we drew closer, their edges blurred and faded into the downpour, dissolving like chalk drawings washed away. We searched the school grounds, calling out Ethan's name amidst the thunder's rumble, but found nothing except his rain-drenched backpack near the swings. That was the last night they watched us, the town enveloped in a tense quietness afterward as if holding its breath. Life resumed, but a sense of mortality lingered, forever haunted by the memory of their vigil. To outsiders, our town remains as peaceful as ever, but for us, it is a quiet facade marred by an aching void, a hollow left by the visitors who took with them a piece of what made us human. It was a rainy Tuesday evening when I received the text that would rattle my entire family's foundations: "You're really going to break my daughter's heart? She's been dreaming of this her whole life." The sender was my sister-in-law, Michelle, whose daughter, a sweet 7-year-old with doe-like eyes named Lily, had long harbored hopes of being a flower girl at my upcoming wedding. The issue was not just that I had rejected her, it was the reason behind it, a reason I kept hidden even from my fiancé, Mark. As a child, I had lost my younger sister in a tragic car accident on a rain-slicked road. She had just turned 7, the same age as Lily. The specter of that day still haunted me. I could vividly recall the way my parents grieved, their world shattered as they buried their only daughter. So, when Michelle approached me with her grand idea, I felt a sense of overwhelming dread instead of joy. "I'm sorry, Michelle, but I can't," I replied, forcing the words out like a weight on my chest. But even then, I could feel the judgment brimming in the silence that followed. "Are you seriously telling me that your trauma is going to ruin what should be a beautiful moment for Lily? Do you know how selfish that sounds?" She shot back, her voice rising. As if my past grief was merely a petty annoyance standing in the way of her dreams. I felt a sharp pain in my gut. I understood where she was coming from, but this wasn't just about flower petals and a pretty dress. Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had made a catastrophic mistake. Family dinners turned tense, conversations stilled as soon as I entered the room, leaving only the awkward hum of my silent phone. One night, after yet another cold glance from Michelle, I confided in Mark. He listened, his brow furrowed deeply, before responding gently, "You do what you need to do. It's your day, after all." But even as he said it, I could see the unease lurking in his eyes, and it gnawed at me. Days turned into sleepless nights, and the anxiety manifested into dreams that felt too real to brush off. My sister ran through a field of wildflowers, laughing, the sunlight dancing on her golden hair, but the laughter morphed into screaming as she fell, and I was there, watching, helpless, like a scene on repeat that I couldn't escape. Each morning, I woke up drenched in sweat, the panic tightening its grip on my heart. Then came the infamous family gathering at my in-laws for a weekend barbecue. As everyone mingled in the backyard, the tension hung thick in the air, and before I knew it, Michelle cornered me by the grill. "You realize you're the only one who thinks this way, right? Everyone else thinks you're being ridiculous. Just apologize to Lily, she's a kid, she doesn't understand," she hissed, her voice low, yet sharp enough to cut through my defenses. It felt as though those words opened a scab that had barely begun to heal, igniting a fire in me. "I can't do it, Michelle. I can't. Watch another little girl take a stroll down an aisle that will always remind me of what I lost," I snapped back, surprised at my own vehemence. The air turned cold, and she blinked, shocked, before a twisted smile crept onto her face. "So, it's true then? You're putting your grief over my daughter's happiness. Congratulations, you've just become the villain of this story." And just like that, I was reduced to a character in a tale I never wanted to star in. I could see it now. My life boiled down to a Reddit post titled "Ida for rejecting my Belle's child being a flower girl." I spent the evening replaying the conversation in my mind, feeling an unsettling mix of shame and clarity, but when I caught the eye of my soon-to-be mother-in-law, her disapproving glare only cemented my role further as the scapegoat. That night, despite Mark's protests, I posted on Reddit, "Ida for saying no to my Bill's daughter as flower girl? Lost my sister as a kid and just can't help but feel it would hurt too much." I anxiously stared at the screen, waiting for the flood of opinions, half hoping to be seen as the misunderstood soul while simultaneously dreading the judgment. Within hours, I was inundated with responses, some empathetic, some harsh, with the most popular comment reading, "You're grieving an entire life, but you shouldn't let that rob another little girl of her joy. You're being an asshole." That hurt more than I could say, the absolute shattering of the already fragile wall of my defenses. I sat there, tears slipping silently down my cheeks as the comments piled up like stones, weighing me down. Days passed, and every time I opened the app, my heart ached with the weight of judgment. The wedding day arrived, and the sky wept in tune with my heart. As I stood at the altar, dressed in white, my knees weak and my hands clammy, each moment felt like a tightrope walk over an abyss. I missed my sister in every sense, and even though my grief echoed loudly, I was determined to not let it rob me of this day. But just as vows were to be exchanged, a soft whimper cut through the silence. It was Lily, standing at the front with her tiny bouquet, her eyes filled with confusion and hurt. I almost cried out to her, my heart breaking for her childlike innocence lost over my decisions. My breath hitched as I saw her holding back tears, and in that moment, everything crashed together, my pain, her pain, the disconnect that had spiraled into something toxic. I pulled my head from the space of my heart long enough to whisper, "I'm sorry, Lily," but I couldn't muster any louder words. My sorrow tasted bitter and raw. And amid the vows, the tears, and the ringing silence, I could hear a soft voice in the corner, echoing like a long-lost memory. She should have worn flowers, reminding me that sometimes, no matter how noble the intentions, holding on to grief can rob us of the beauty unfolding right in front of us, a bitter reality that looked a whole lot like an apology left unspoken, leaving us all irrevocably changed. It started with a simple thread on Ask Reddit that blew up unexpectedly, the question being innocuous: fans of dead celebrities, which death hurt you the most? I remember scrolling through the responses late one night, fueled by a mix of loneliness and nostalgia. Each post was a personal confession, a shared grief that reawakened a part of me I'd tucked away, and as I read tales of heartbreak over legends lost, like the tragic endings of Robin Williams and David Bowie, I felt an odd sense of connection, yet also a prickle of discomfort that began to settle in my stomach. One comment caught my eye and sent a chill down my spine. A user named DocRec described an encounter that happened in the wake of John Lennon's assassination. It was eerie, almost supernatural, how he felt a shift in his reality, suddenly being enveloped in darkness as if the world itself mourned, and as he stood frozen in his room, his record player spinning old Beatles vinyl, he said he heard a whisper that wasn't quite human. "It's not over," it whispered, but he never really explained what that meant. I was entranced and terrified, each word resonating like a drumbeat in my head. Then came the stranger part. I noticed my own urge to comment. I felt compelled to share my experience, even though it felt trivial in comparison, how when I was 14, my classmates mercilessly made fun of me for not wanting an American name. My real name, Hannah, carried a beautiful meaning in my culture, but more often than not, it was slurred together by my peers into something unrecognizable, like Hannah Montana. I don't know why it bothered me enough to write about it while others were sharing their grief for dearly departed stars, maybe because it hurt just as much? Before I knew it, I had spilled out my experience into a post that felt like a confession, detailing how I had once spoken out against taking an American name, tearing into me as if I were some kind of traitor to my own identity, and beneath the laughter of my classmates, I had swallowed my pride until the day I finally stood up and declared, "This is who I am." I won't change, even though it cost me friendships that I thought were worth more than the ability to wear a label that felt artificial. I hit submit and leaned back, letting out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. The responses weren't what I expected. They ranged from supportive to downright aggressive, accusing me of being too sensitive or creating too many problems. One user named Angel in the Dark even told me I deserved all the ridicule I got for not conforming to this American ideal, and that's when something switched in me, and I felt a creeping sensation as if shadows were gathering around my room. Something deep inside, the desperation of its opening a door I didn't mean to unlock. As I dove into the comments, trying to defend myself against the onslaught, I felt a chill run down my spine, as if the room temperature had dropped, my breath forming little clouds as I typed. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw a shape hovering, a shifting presence barely discernible behind me, and I turned to find only the reflection of myself in the darkened screen. Panic began to creep through the edges of my rational mind, and I shut down my computer, but that did little to rid me of the nagging feeling I wasn't alone. Frantic, I searched the threads, hoping to find something that would quell my unease, only to find one last comment from Doc Rec. "You do not know what you invite when you're on the precipice of grief," it read ominously. The next hour was dawning upon me with shadows closing in as I felt every emotion I had bottled up over the years slam into me in waves. The death of a beloved celebrity was one thing, but the bitter realities of identity lost in laughter? It hurt just as much, and somehow feeling myself melt into the very ether of the digital space made it all the more visceral. My phone buzzed with a notification. It was a reply to my original post. It was only the beginning of the storm, the anticipation. The gathering wind screamed through my curtains, and all I could do was watch as notifications barreled in faster than I could read them. I felt dizzy, consumed by the anger and pain of every other broken soul echoing back through the internet, all colliding in this swelling, unrelenting tide. Night drifted until it blended into early dawn, and just when I thought I'd emerge unscathed, a fresh comment fed my disquiet. A new user had entered. The username was just a series of numbers like a countdown, and the comment read, "You shouldn't have asked." Suddenly, my phone buzzed again. "The dead are awake. Accept your fate." I threw my phone across the room, desperate to escape the immediate weight that felt as if it was crushing me, the air growing heavier with each heartbeat. But a part of me felt curiously intrigued, compelled to Instagram the threads and share them with friends, drawing them into this inexplicable vortex. I sent it, feeling exhilarated, and then I got a reply from a friend saying, "What is wrong with you?" It was too late. I was knee-deep in those dark waters I dared to traverse. The buzzing persisted, each notification intensifying the sense of dread. Friends began calling, demanding to know if I'd lost my mind, my sanity waning beneath their frantic yells as my room plunged into complete darkness. With every unanswered query and eerie invitation, I felt the presence solidify around me, wailing with the sharp cuts of lives lost, words unspoken, and identity battles. The specter of every celebrity that ever breathed life into my world clawed their way through the pixelated screen, begging to be heard. I glanced back and saw the face, grim and familiar, tracing the contours of the screen in shadow form, as if whispered promises of dying dreams wrapped around tightly, strangling the hope left in my chest. The revelation hit me. This was my penance, my reckoning. For every laugh I swallowed, every moment of silence that turned into a scream. They were here to remind me, to unravel what bound us together. Lost within that bitter digital sea, I was left wishing for something more than grief, the claws of darkness encroaching behind me until I could hardly breathe, and realization struck as I understood that I wasn't mourning them, I was mourning what I allowed to be extinguished in myself, and now it was echoing back, an unending cycle of resentment and sorrow entwined with the feel of ghosts of what never could be, the hollow laughter turning into a suffocating silence that echoed forever through the cosmos, and with that final thought, as my vision blurred into nothingness, I knew I had become just another story in a thread that was never meant to end. Ever since I was a kid, I had a fascination with animals, but it wasn't until I adopted a scruffy, one-eyed terrier named Max that I truly understood the bond pets can forge with their humans. I still remember the day I brought him home. He cautiously sniffed every corner of my living room, as if trying to uncover the secrets hidden within my four walls. Over the weeks, our lives intertwined, each moment deepening our connection, but it was during one particular night that everything shifted. I was sitting on the couch, wrapped in a haze of depression after a painful breakup, my eyes glued to the flickering television, when Max jumped up and nudged my hand with his muzzle. I absent-mindedly scratched behind his ear, still lost in my thoughts, but then he turned around, laid his head on my lap, and let out a soft whine. I looked down, startled, as if waking from a trance. He seemed to know I was hurting. I chuckled lightly through my tears and told him I'd be okay, but as soon as I spoke, he perked up, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity I had never seen before. Each day that followed turned into an unspoken understanding. He would sit by my side during my darkest moments, follow me around the house when I couldn't stop pacing, even bounding toward the door as if urging me to step outside for fresh air. One evening, I sat in the backyard, enveloped by the chilling silence of twilight, an empty bottle of wine in hand while the stars flickered above, and I felt an overwhelming sense of isolation. I whispered my regrets about life and love into the night, not expecting a reply. But Max, who had been laying quietly, suddenly stood up, barking fiercely before he sprinted to the edge of the yard. My heart raced in confusion, and I followed, watching as he stood, staring intently into the darkness beyond the fence, his body tense and ready. Had he seen something? A raccoon? A neighbor's cat? But as I squinted into the shadows, my stomach plummeted, because for the first time, I felt the cold grip of foreboding. Just as I turned to ask him what he had seen, his angry growls turned into an almost mournful whine, his body shaking with palpable fear. I picked him up, trying to reassure him, but even as I did, my instinct screamed at me to retreat indoors. The feeling lingered, a heaviness in the air, as if something was watching us, something unseen yet profoundly present. When I finally plopped back onto the couch, my heartbeat racing, Max's demeanor shifted entirely. He curled up beside me, quivering, and I wrapped him in my arms, but I couldn't shake the unease. Days passed, and with every sunset, I felt the air grow more oppressive, as if the very walls of my house were closing in. Max seemed to become my guardian, alerting me with soft growls whenever he sensed something was amiss. He refused to leave my side and would often seat himself facing the window as if he sensed something lurking outside. I laughed it off at first. I told myself I was being melodramatic and that dogs can just be anxious sometimes, but weird occurrences began to seep into our routine. I'd wake up in the middle of the night to the sound of scratching at the door, but when I opened it, I found nothing but the yawning emptiness of my dark hallway. Max would growl lowly, staring into the abyss of the dimly lit corridor, and I'd feel a chill run down my spine as I dutifully shooed whatever phantom he sensed away. Things escalated when I discovered a small hole beneath the fence, one I could slip through. Leaving the door slightly ajar one afternoon, I ventured out to investigate the woods behind my house, only to find a strange, unmarked path winding deeper into the forest. A part of me was intrigued, but the other, larger part felt a strong pull to retreat. Max howled insistently from the yard, uncharacteristically panicked, and I hesitated, sensing an oppressive presence that seemed to emanate from those trees. I didn't follow the path, but within days, strange things began to happen, like a series of putrid odors that periodically wafted through the air from within the brush, unnervingly reminding me of decaying leaves and something else, something indescribable. I could see Max every so often darting toward the edge of the yard, barking furiously at something hidden from view, his eyes wide with fear and fury. I soon realized that whatever was lurking in the shadows wasn't just a figment of my imagination, it had been haunting us, tormenting my sweet boy. One night, I stayed up late reading, the house quiet except for the rustle of pages and the soft sound of Max snoring beside me, but then I heard it, a single, low growl that slipped through the silence, causing my spine to tingle. I dismissed it, attributing it to nightmares manifesting in the stillness, but then Max shot up, eyes darting, muscles tense as if poised to attack. My heart raced, I hadn't heard the noise again, yet Max was fixated on the back door, and my sense of dread intensified. Despite my better judgment, I crept toward the door, heart hammering in my chest, preparing myself for whatever awaited me beyond. When I finally pulled it open, a gust of cold wind rushed past, and as I stepped out, instinctively calling for Max, I felt something brush against me, soft and fleeting, like a gust brushing past skin. I stumbled and fell, heart racing, the night around me impossibly dark, but as I looked up, I saw Max standing at the edge of the yard, staring into the depths of the forest, eyes alight with panic and primal instinct. It was then I realized, he was trying to protect me from something. I called out to him, but my voice sounded hollow in the thick air, and suddenly the shadows in the trees seemed to writhe with life. My heart pounded as I scrambled back inside, Max sprinting in beside me, pressing against the door as if shielding me from the darkness outside. Over the following weeks, the nights grew longer and darker, the shadows deepening in the corners of my home. One evening, after a particularly harrowing night, Max refused to eat, retreating to his bed and casting worried glances at the door. It broke my heart. This was my brave little guardian, yet even he was quaking under some unseen terror. Something was coming. I didn't know how to fight it. I spent that entire night questioning every creak in the house, jumping at the smallest sound, while the pit in my stomach twisted with fear. But whether by fate or some divine instinct, I could hear Max's low growls turn to frantic whimpers as he puffed his small frame against the door, urging me again and again to keep it closed. As night stretched out endlessly, I felt the ominous weight of something uninvited linger just outside our realm, pushing against the veil of reality, and even as Max remained vigilant, each tick of the clock felt like a countdown to an inevitable petrifying confrontation. At last, with the dawn finally creeping in, I slumped against the door, utterly exhausted. I fell asleep with my face pressed against the wood, and as the sun inched into view, something shifted in my dreams, a whisper flittering through the haze, a voice that carried familiarity, the kind that ignites every forgotten nightmare. I bolted upright, heart racing, unclear whether I was still dreaming or whether a nightmare had bled into reality. From my hazy, dream-wrought state, I heard it again. My name, soft and echoing from the shadows in the space beyond. Panic darted through my veins, and I dashed to Max, who lay curled up, ears perked, still staring into the darkness. Dread thickened around me as a chill descended, and for the first time, I felt something primordial lurking behind the door, something far older and far more terrifying than anything I could comprehend. But just as I reached to open it, Max let out a deafening bark, jumping up and shoving his nose against the crack without hesitation, snapping me back into reality. The portal to whatever sinister world lay just beyond the threshold never opened, but it was clear I was by no means safe. That night I made a decision: we would leave. As much as this house held cherished memories, the growing fear held us captive, and as dawn unfurled across the sky, we packed our things. Max was my anchor, the one who kept me grounded, and I wouldn't leave him behind. The car rumbled to life, but just as I was about to drive away, I looked back at the house, shrouded in claustrophobic shadows. It was time to let go of this place. We would find new beginnings, just not in the presence of whatever had begun to worm its way into our lives. But before I pulled away, I caught a glimpse of something moving in the periphery, something alive within the corner of my eye. I turned sharply, but only darkness stared back. Without caution, I leaned in closer, and that was when I saw him, the little figure of a fox staring back at us from the garden. But this wasn't just a curious creature, the look in its eyes mirrored the very same terror I had felt when standing on that threshold. And just like that, the understanding seemed to click. Max had known, all along. He knew when something was off, he knew when the barriers between worlds began to shift, and it hit me in that very moment: he wasn't just a dog. He understood. With fear echoing in my chest, I turned to Max and nodded, and without needing to say a word, we drove off into the soft morning light, leaving behind the whispers and the shadows, knowing that whatever lingered would not follow us into our future. When my siblings and I heard the news about our childhood home, the old brick house that had been our fortress and our prison, we didn't shed a single tear. In fact, we couldn't stop smiling, giddy with the idea of inheriting something so grand, even if it was a relic of our tragic past. Mom and Dad had passed unexpectedly just a week apart, swallowed into the depths of an anonymous car crash at the edge of town, the kind of twist that snapped our remaining strings of innocence. But all we could think about were the hidden treasures within the house, their eccentric inheritance plan that had seemed more like a game than a serious will. Rather than the sorrow one might expect from three grieving children, a rush of exhilaration filled the air as we stood on the porch of the beloved old home, an ominous place cloaked in memories both beautiful and horrific, where laughter turned to sorrow quicker than the flick of a light switch. Just behind the heavy wooden door, we knew, lay countless boxes filled with remnants of our parents' lives, and in them, perhaps the key to our future without the weight of their absence dragging us down. Siblings by blood but strangers by experience, I felt a thrill race through me, as if we were opening a Christmas present, only to discover we were not alone. The air grew thick with an unexplainable tension, as if the house itself was breathing, dissecting and digesting the pulses of our trepidation and delight. And so we ventured inside, the musty smell of dust and forgotten memories choking us as we entered, our footsteps echoing through the long abandoned corridors, ornate wallpaper curling at the edges as if recoiling from our presence. But the house welcomed us with a creak, like an old friend who had stretched its arms wide to embrace us again. As my brother, Caleb, stumbled into the living room, the sunlight flickered through the grimy windows, illuminating the forgotten family portraits that lined the walls. Mom, perpetually grinning as if the camera would capture her eternal joy. Dad, stoic, eyes like windows into a soul that was always just out of reach. I felt an odd pressure in my chest, a sensation I didn't recognize, and yet my siblings and I shared a secret communication through our glances. This wasn't just grief, it was a pact, unspoken yet palpable, that whatever lay within these walls would be ours for the taking. We scoured room after room, swept through the kitchen overflowing with dust-coated utensils and stagnant memories, each drawer revealing mundane yet intimate objects, the kind of things that echoed warmth in a cold room. But it was when we reached the attic that the true prize revealed itself. Sitting atop the wooden floorboards like a forgotten deity was an ornately carved chest, decorated with symbols I had never seen before. After a moment of hesitation, I lifted the heavy lid, its rusty hinges groaning as if they, too, were intimately familiar with the contents within, and as it revealed itself, the dim light flickered to life, illuminating a trove of photographs, letters, and a set of keys that felt heavy with consequence. A knot formed in my stomach. The photos depicted our parents, but not just in the moments we remembered. There were images of them smiling with unfamiliar friends, participating in bizarre rituals under the moonlight, and even images of us, captured while we slept, laughing, or imperfectly vulnerable. The more we dug, the more unsettling the discoveries became. Newspaper clippings chronicling disappearances around town and more pictures of our parents alongside figures twisted into grotesque caricatures of joy. I could hardly breathe as I realized they were part of something darker, hidden beneath layers of family devotion. We gathered in a tight circle around the chest, fear now creeping into our excitement as we exchanged nervous glances, the thrill of discovery suddenly overshadowed by a creeping horror. My sister, Mia, turned to us with a quivering lip, suggesting that we should leave the chest where it was, but Caleb, emboldened by greed or a reckless desire to claim our inheritance, proposed we take the chest with us. "It's ours now, right? Just look at all this stuff," he declared, eyes sparkling with enthusiasm yet frustration at the sudden chill in the air. In that moment, the house seemed to sigh, walls breathing heavily as the light flickered ominously overhead, warning us perhaps, but we couldn't turn away from the chest, our hearts pounding in synchrony as we nodded and conjured together the strength to drag it down the creaky staircase. As we stepped outside, the sun began to set, casting terrifying shadows that danced within our periphery, and that is when the universe shifted. A chill splintered through the air, and the day shifted to dusk too quickly, shadows creeping into the very fibers of the house, enveloping us like a thick blanket. The chest felt heavier than before, each step toward the car almost a struggle, as if the house was grasping at us, desperate to keep its secrets intact. An anxious silence fell upon us, punctuated only by our synchronized gasps as we reached the front lawn. Just when we thought we were free, a shriek ripped through the air, a sound entangling joy with terror, and before we could turn back, the house groaned deeper and louder, shaking in a way that felt like it was alive. The ground trembled beneath us as my siblings screamed, the fear bubbling from my throat as I dropped the chest. The world spun, and the house loomed larger, raw with age and anger. Just as we inched back, losing ourselves to the murmurings of terror, the front door slammed shut with a force that echoed through the night, a finality that resonated deep within us. This was the house's farewell, its own dramatic funeral, but it was not ours. We stumbled away from the vintage property, the moonlight casting our forms into shadows as we fled into the night, hearts pounding and terror-stricken. All the inheritance we'd expected turned to ash in our mouths, the umbilical cord to our past severed by our parents' legacy we so desperately sought to claim but had been warned away from. And now, lying awake that night in my freezing bedroom miles away, the chest endlessly gnawed at my mind, a tangle of dark echoes. As I understood, we were not the inheritors, we were merely ghosts rattling chains in a home that remained ever watchful, waiting for our return, so it could unveil its true funeral, and for what sins we might have to pay. I always thought that the tension in my family was just a backdrop to the chaos of life, but it took me a long time to realize that it wasn't just an annoying soundtrack, it was a sign of something much deeper, something darker. My mom vanished 6 years ago without a word, and it was like the world had swallowed her. We spent those years torn apart and confused, searching for answers that just weren't there. I was only 15, lost in a swirl of childhood innocence, which felt like a cruel joke when I compared it to my father's lifeless eyes and the way he refused to talk about her. It wasn't until her return last Christmas that everything came crashing down again. She stepped through the door like she'd just been away on holiday, and her smile sliced through the heavy air that had settled over our home, but it felt wrong. Each day that went by, I felt more like a stranger in my own house, where I was supposed to feel warmth and security. I mean, after all, she had just reappeared, and the questions were piling up like snowdrifts. How could she waltz back into our lives as if nothing had happened when the scars were still fresh? A part of me desperately wanted to forgive her, to be the dutiful daughter who welcomed her mother with open arms, yet another part of me wanted to scream until the veins in my neck burst, to bring all those hidden truths to the light, What had she actually been doing for all these years? Instead, I swallowed my words, buried my hurt under the false pretense of normalcy. But slowly, behind the forced smiles and small family dinners, a festering resentment started clawing its way to the surface until, one evening, I snapped. I didn't plan it. I was sitting at the dinner table, looking at her, that same warm smile glowing like nothing had ever happened, but I could see the flickering of guilt behind her eyes, and without thinking, I spat it out. "Mom, do you remember the time you disappeared for 6 years?" The silence that followed was suffocating, akin to a thick fog rolling in on a quiet night. The look on her face was like I had struck her with a blunt instrument, and my father's fork clattered to the plate like the final nail in the coffin. I saw the way her smile faded, replaced by the raw vulnerability of a woman who had clearly been living in fear, and she opened her mouth to speak, but it felt like something dark was rising from her throat, and she simply shut it again. That's when the arguing started, her voice rising and falling like waves crashing against the rocks until she shouted an accusation that took me by surprise and hit me right in the chest. "You have no idea what it was like for me." It was in that moment I realized she needed to justify her absence to me, to convince me that her journey had value, and I wanted to scream that I had suffered, too. The silence after the storm lingered as she dialed it back, taking a deep breath with that same look she must have worn 6 years ago when she'd chosen to swallow her demons over confronting them. I waded through the memories, tried to piece together the past. It was like looking at shattered glass, trying to remember that perfect portrait of my life before her disappearance. But as I clung to my resentment, the creeping fear began to twist around my stomach. What if she hadn't just disappeared? What if, while she was gone, she had crossed paths with something darker, something that now hung over our home like a storm cloud, and I could sense it lurking in the shadows? Was she even the same woman who had left me? When night fell, she kept having these restless bouts of insomnia, waking in a cold sweat, whispering, "They can't find me here, not here," and part of me wanted to reach out for her, to ease her mind, but something sinister warped the air. I felt a chill that I couldn't shake. Was it because she had been gone? Or was it because whatever she had brought back with her wanted to reclaim what it lost? So I tiptoed around her like we were both standing on a tightrope, waiting for the wind to hit, and for weeks, we lived in this precarious balance of unspoken truths and false bravado until another argument broke loose. I cornered her one afternoon on the porch, the sun cast long shadows as I tried to keep my voice steady. "You can't just pretend that everything's okay when you've had years of silence," I told her, and her gaze became unfocused, as if she were looking through me and into the past, a past that I still had no access to, and black darkness pulled at her feet as she shuddered and blurted, "You don't understand what I had to do to survive." That was a pivotal moment, and I felt the walls around me shake as she casually let slip that whatever she had done to return to me was drenched in despair, that I didn't realize, until that exact moment, that all those missing pieces of her life must be eternal burdens, the echoes of choices that must have haunted her like ghosts. And then her tone dropped to a whisper, filled with an emotion so raw and profound that it sent chills crawling down my spine. I escaped them, but they followed me. Those words rang through the air like a warning bell, and I instinctively took a step back, the world around me warping as I wrestled with my instincts. Who were they? Shadows? Monsters? Or perhaps, and more chilling, something human, souls she had let down while trying to claw her way back to me. The dread started to settle deep within me, making everything I had once accepted now feel like an elaborate facade veiling a catastrophe. I confronted her clear-headedly, searching for answers, but she just bit her lip and asked me to let it go, to forgive and forget. But each time she said it, I could feel her words hung heavy in the air as though she expected me to carry the weight of her sins. I was a monster for wanting to dig into her past, to uncover the truth that had transformed her into a specter who slipped through our fingers. When friends and family visited, we presented a facade of cohesion. Everyone claimed to see the old her rekindled, but I felt like I was viewing a ghost as she went through the motions of daily life, and I wanted to expose the specter to the light. It culminated one night after a dinner party that I forced on myself to make things normal. I reached a breaking point and finally asked a question that had been gnawing at my heart. "Mom, were you a part of something terrible?" Her eyes widened with the kind of fear that roots itself deep and doesn't let go. It was there for an agonizing moment, suspended in the air, until she surged to her feet, nearly flipping the dinner table, snapping at me with primal fury unlike anything I had ever seen from her before. "You think it was easy? Every day spent in agony? You don't know, you can't possibly understand." And just like that, she was gone again, storming into her bedroom and locking the door, leaving me feeling like the intruder in my own life, threads of memories wound tighter than before. That night I lay awake in my bed, listening to the sound of her cries, a deep, echoing grief that wrapped around my heart and tore me in two. I wanted to comfort her. I wanted to confront whatever dark reality she'd brought back with her instead. The further this went, the more I felt overwhelmed, standing on the precipice of a maelstrom that wanted to drag me in. And in the lull after the storm, when quiet settled back in, fear crept back under my skin as shadows danced along our home like forgotten whispers. But the turning point came 3 days later when I found an old journal tucked away in the attic, yellowed and fraying. My heart raced as I opened it, words spilling onto the pages revealing a hidden world of nightmares, an exploration into unspeakable rituals, a family tied to ancient darkness, with ramblings that twisted reality into chaos. Her secrets yanked the breath from my lungs, and in that moment, I realized why she had disappeared. She didn't just go away, she had been trading pieces of herself away, her history for survival, for whispered dark promises. But it was too late now, whatever was inside her could no longer be exorcised, for it had grown roots deep within her. Armed with this truth, I confronted her one last time, standing my ground at the doorway to her sanctuary, my heart drum beating in my chest. "Mom, you need to face this, whatever you've brought back, it isn't just going to stay hidden, it's in your eyes, in your soul, and it isn't just your problem anymore." I let her digest my words as fear mingled with something primal, something glimmering under her skin before she finally spoke softly. "I thought if I returned, I could forget. I was wrong," and there was this look of alien desperation that twisted her features, and then she stepped closer, her hand shaking as she reached out for me. "You must not let it in, whatever you do, don't let it inside." That night was unbearably still as the shadows seeped through the door toward me, tentacles of doubts creeping in after every fleeting moment of her embrace. It crept under my skin, saturating my nights, until that unwelcome feeling of being observed, stalked, echoed in the silence of our home. 1 week later, it took a brutal turn when I woke up to her screaming. I dashed to her room, my heart racing, and flung the door open, but it wasn't her standing there, it was a silhouette, an outline of a dark figure shrouded in the soft luminance of the moonlight. I could see the terror in her eyes, and as I lifted my hand toward her, the figure vanished into a plume of shadows, leaving behind an air of despair that lingered in the room long after. "It's not over," she whispered, and I clutched my chest, realizing then that this was the beginning of the end, for us both. I remained trapped in that limbo for what felt like eternities, until the day she told me she was leaving again. She couldn't stay, the darkness was pulling her back, and this time, she wouldn't be coming back. I raged against her, demanded to know what had changed, but she simply shook her head, tears streaming down her face as she braced herself for what lay ahead. "I thought coming home was enough, but I was just a pawn. I won't let them take you too." Her voice trembled as she finally revealed that she had been trying to keep me safe, that all these years, she had been sacrificing herself for me. In that moment, I became the reflection of everything she had faced, the lost daughter, the one left behind to carry on the unbroken cycle, seeking both resolution and truth. My heart shattered as she embraced my trembling body for the final time, leaving me standing in the empty room, echoes of her cries compressing into nothingness, and as the door clicked shut, I suddenly felt lighter, yet utterly bereaved, because I wondered, was she a part of a darker lineage, or was she truly just a desperate mother looking for a way to escape the chaos? Months turned into an unrelenting stream of isolation as I rifled through boxes in search of signs, answers as to why she had left and what she had encountered, but all I found were shadows gliding through the corners of my mind. To this day, I stay awake battling those visions that dance in front of me, opening doors in my dreams that expose deep fears buried in the darkness. And every so often, I catch echoes of her voice, replacing the silence with a warning, "You must tell them when it's time to leave." But I often think about the little things, the shared laughter, the memories before the darkness consumed her, and wonder if I too am now haunted or if the darkness will finally come for me. Am I the asshole for unearthing something she wanted to forget? Or am I just a daughter lost in a labyrinth of shadows, searching for a way to save both her mother and herself from the encroaching night? I thought the family reunion would be a chance for us to unwind, reminisce, and celebrate the bonds that shared our blood, but little did I know that beneath the surface of laughter and barbecue smoke, tension loomed. My Uncle Jack, with his booming voice and all too innocent demeanor, had the habit of cracking jokes that teetered on the edge of inappropriate, but this time, as he leered at my girlfriend Clara, I felt an icy chill seep into my gut. We had been dating for just over 6 months, and to me, she was the most beautiful person in the world, radiating kindness and a joy that made every moment spent with her feel sacred. When Clara walked into the backyard, her laughter bubbling over as she greeted my relatives, Uncle Jack's gaze fell upon her like a predator zeroing in on its unsuspecting prey. First came the compliments, hollow flattery laced with an undertone that sent shivers down my spine. "You know," he said, grinning like a Cheshire cat, "if I were 20 years younger, I'd be chasing after you." The comment was slathered in what felt like a mix of flirtation and something darker, an unwelcome attention that was not only uncomfortable but alarming. I said nothing at first, hoping it was just a misguided joke, but as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the yard, Uncle Jack's remarks only escalated. He leaned closer, too close in my opinion, brushing against Clara's shoulder as he told her she could be a model if she'd just lost a few pounds, a laugh tacked onto the end of each unsuitable observation, as if that would soften the blow of his words. I could feel my heartbeat resonate in my throat, an insistent drummer warning me to intervene. Clara shifted uncomfortably, her smile faltering. It was a moment where I had a choice, to stand idly by or to protect the one person I adored more than anything else in this world. I seized my chance, emboldened by a protective rage that coursed through me like wildfire, the words spilling out before I could stop myself. "Hey Jack, why don't you keep your comments to yourself? You're being a creep." The air thickened with immediate tension, a stunned silence silencing the laughter that had hung so desperately overhead like a storm cloud. Uncle Jack's face morphed from jovial to thunderous, and the eyes of my entire family turned toward me, some in shock, others in horror. Uncle Jack's jaw clenched, and he let out a harsh laugh, trying to redirect the focus. "Come on, lighten up. Just a joke. No need to get all worked up." But I pressed on, feeling emboldened by an unexpected wave of support. "You may think it's funny, but it's really not. Clara deserves respect, not your unwanted comments." It was a gamble, a roll of the dice that could fracture family ties, but it was worth it to me. The collective gasp that rippled through the crowd confirmed my fears. I had crossed an unspoken line. I could see it in the corner of my grandmother's eyes, disappointment mixed with fear, the kind that creates fissures in family folklore. Uncle Jack's face hardened, and in that moment, something dark flickered within him. "You really shouldn't speak to your elders that way," he said, eyes narrowed, lowering his voice to a chilling whisper that scraped against my skin. I felt my resolve wavering, but I refused to let fear trap me. I could feel Clara beside me, her soft hand brushing against my arm in silent support. "You're an asshole, Uncle Jack," I said, and the words tasted like fire on my tongue, exhilarating and terrifying. The awkward silence was now replaced with a cacophony of murmurs, the tension thick enough to cut through. Family members whispered and darted their eyes between us, some half-heartedly attempting to diffuse the situation with nervous laughter, others shocked into silence. Eventually, Uncle Jack straightened, his mouth twisting into an expression of barely contained rage, and he stepped closer, invading my personal space, teeth clenched. "Watch yourself, kid. You think you know what's best here? You're just a kid. You don't know how it runs in this family." I felt my breath catch in my throat, the room swirling around me as the weight of his words sank in, but I stood firm. The confrontation was intoxicating. Part of me wanted to back down, to flee, to meld back into the mundane conversations of an average family reunion, but the other part reveled in the righteousness of my indignation. "I don't care what this family thinks is normal. What you did was disgusting, and it won't stand." I heard Clara draw in a sharp breath beside me, her eyes glimmering with unspoken pride, but also worry for the backfire of my actions. The loud boisterous laughter of the barbecue resumed, an obvious attempt to drown out the anger sizzling between us like a pan left too long on the heat. People murmured as they trod carefully around our explosive confrontation, stealing furtive glances as if trying to navigate a bomb set to go off. Just then, Clara's father, a taciturn man with an air of authority, intervened, stepping into the tempest with a placid expression that belied the tightening tension. "That's enough, Jack," he said, his voice low but commanding. "You need to apologize." A hush fell over the scene, the gravity of his command hanging heavy. Uncle Jack's reaction was immediate. He bristled, jaw set, fists clenching, and for a terrifying moment, I thought he might lash out. The atmosphere crackled like electricity, an ominous thrill coursing through everyone present. But slowly, undoubtedly, Uncle Jack's rage melted into something that could only be described as resignation. "Fine," he spat, eyes darting from me to Clara, unwilling to acknowledge the light of reason in the crowd. "I'm sorry, whatever." His words dripped with insincerity, but a strange wave of relief washed over me nonetheless. I had stood my ground, and while the satisfied look on Clara's face meant the world, so too did the silence that descended after Uncle Jack's reluctant apology. The reunion began to push itself back into ordinary rhythms, laughter timidly replacing tension, Yet there was a damning undercurrent that nearly everyone could feel. I knew it was far from over, the family drama would bubble beneath the surface, waiting to explode at a later date. But at that moment, enveloped in the evening's fading light with Clara by my side, I felt like I had done the right thing, shattered though my own sense of normalcy had become. The night wore on, but I could see Uncle Jack lurking in the periphery, unbending and locked in his sour mood, a lonely specter amidst the revelry. The reunion might have continued, but I wondered at what cost. Was I the villain in a story told and retold beyond the walls of that backyard, or had I thwarted a monster masquerading as family? Honestly, I didn't care. I had chosen the mantle of protector, and in that moment, with Clara leaning into me as if solidifying the bond we shared, I felt empowered. Even as I held my breath, wondering what the next family gathering would bring, I wouldn't falter. Not again. I always promised myself I wouldn't turn this into a cry for help. I mean, where's the dignity in that? But here I am, fingers hovering over the keyboard, attempting to explain something inexplicable. My name? Let's leave it at that. After all, this isn't really about me anymore, it's about what's scratching away at the surface of my sanity, gnawing on the edges of my reality until all that's left is a frayed specter of the person I used to be. It started 3 months ago, innocently enough, with a postcard. I found it on my dusty old doormat after a particularly endless Tuesday at the office. I knew better than to indulge in nostalgia, but there it was, a picture of a lighthouse standing tall against a tumultuous sea. On the back, in looping, elegant script, it simply read, "Remember." Just that. Nothing more. At first, I laughed it off. A prank, surely. Somebody was just getting in my head, trying to make me chase shadows. But that one-word message gnawed at me in the night when sleep felt like an old photograph, something I could see in my mind but couldn't actually grasp. I checked the postmark, something I wasn't inclined to usually do. It was dated from 10 years ago, from some place I couldn't quite place, which only added to the mystery. By morning, the intrigue had set its hooks in deep. I confided in my best friend, Mark, who half listened, dismissing my growing obsession as the latest in my series of quirks, like the time I convinced myself my neighbor was hiding a fugitive or how I swore there was something alive in my attic. But this was different, or so I told myself. Then came the dreams. Dreams of a churning sea, relentless and indifferent, and that same lighthouse blurring across the horizon like a distant watchtower. In these dreams, I felt eyes on me, patient, calm, and knowing. The lighthouse's beam would sweep across the dark waters, igniting the night like a silent, ethereal watchman, freezing the whirling chaos into a momentary pause of clarity. By the third dream, I swear I began waking up with the taste of salt on my lips. Alarmed and increasingly isolated in my descent into what felt like madness, I began looking for answers wherever they might be found. Discarded bookstores and damp library basements, searching for that lighthouse, connecting threads that refused to form a cohesive picture. It was on an obscure forum that I found it, the Lighthouse of Quiescence, an urban legend nestled deep in coastal folklore. It existed somewhere off the beaten path, unmapped, unmarked, a spectral guide for those lost at sea and within themselves. The tale, I learned, claimed that the lighthouse calls to those who have been forgotten, either by the world or by themselves, drawing them into some existential purgatory from which there might be no return. I tried to share these findings with Mark, desperate for some validation, but he was already too far distanced from me by then, peering at me like an oddity he couldn't quite justify keeping in his life. Alone, I booked a ticket to the nearest coastal town, the dream's whisper haunting my every step. I could feel an inexplicable connection growing stronger, each heartbeat syncing with the ocean's rhythmic pulse. Upon arrival, the town was quaint but old-fashioned, with townsfolk who greeted tourists with wary smiles and eyes that followed you long after you'd passed. It was there, in the shadow of an aging lighthouse keeper, that I found what I hoped I would. He spoke little, his speech heavy with the weight of stories he had no interest in sharing, yet his eyes betrayed him, holding fragments of revelations that terrified him still. I managed to ask about the Lighthouse of Quiescence, and through a crooked smirk, he simply nodded before slipping back into the misty afternoons, leaving me with only the ocean's ceaseless roar for company. Days blurred as I combed the rocky shorelines, each salt-laden breeze whispering fears into my ear. Nightly, the dreams intensified until they became unbearable, tinged with a sadness that was both foreign and achingly familiar. One night, the dream's holistic tapestry snapped. There, among the rocks, a shadow emerged, engulfing the lighthouse beams. My eyes were no longer just mine, I was an open vessel, a willing recipient of whatever mysteries the mist chose to unravel. I stumbled upon a crumbling, obscured pathway to the lighthouse, almost as if the earth decided I was finally worthy of its secrets. I climbed the jagged rocks, each step resonating with the fraught anticipation of inevitability. The lighthouse stood immensely silent, its door ajar, inviting. Inside, the air was thick with decades of solitude. I climbed the spiral stairs, memories resurfacing with each step, barely there, but real enough to almost touch. At the top, a final confrontation awaited. The light spun languidly, its rotations cutting through the metal maelstrom, providing snapshots of clarity. I realized it was never just a lighthouse, it was a conduit, a junction between despair and an elusive solace, a chance to shed the weight of self that binds us all. The realization hit with a profound, bone-deep certainty. The postcard was sent by me, to me. It was a prelude, a harbinger of both an end and a beginning. Kneeling at the edge, peering into the infinite darkness, there was a choice to be made, and in that moment, consciousness unfurled like a sail catching the wind. Whatever remains of me sits now at the lighthouse's edge, reminding those who seek with their hearts but not their minds that shadows are patient. I've given up on myself as I once knew me, true, but here, where the cusp of reality and myth conspire, I found there's something comforting in eternity's relentless embrace. I always thought I knew pain, I've had my fair share of heartbreaking experiences and physical injuries, but they all felt like a warm-up compared to the real nightmare that would soon unfold. It all started with an innocuous question on Reddit: what's a type of pain people underestimate until they experience it for themselves? I found myself scrolling through comments, nodding along, but one post caught my eye, a woman detailing her experience with a weightlifting injury that led to chronic nerve pain. She spoke of it like it was a living entity, gnawing away at her sanity day in and day out. I couldn't shake the image of her suffering. I tossed and turned that night, unable to comprehend how pain could unravel a person so completely. The following week, I decided to hit the gym, feeling invincible, to prove that I was tougher than the stories I had read. I loaded my barbell with weights, the cold metal feeling empowering as I settled into a squat, but the moment I pushed up, I felt a sharp, piercing pain shoot through my lower back, an agony I had never known before. I dropped the weights, gasping for air, but I laughed it off as a fleeting moment of discomfort, unaware that this was just the beginning. I ignored the warning signs. Even though I struggled to lift my bag for the next couple of days, I convinced myself it was just a muscle strain that would fade. Instead, it blossomed into something darker, a relentless flame igniting in my spine and cocooning my body in unforgiving knots. I spent hours researching remedies like a crazed scientist, desperate for relief, to no avail. I visited doctors and specialists. They took turns poking and prodding, diagnosing everything from sciatica to herniated discs, and each misdiagnosis chipped away at my hope. The pain morphed into this uninvited entity, coiling around my thoughts, squeezing tighter each time I dared to ignore it. I noticed weird things happening. Objects would fall from shelves in my apartment when I was resting, my hands would shake as I glimpsed what I thought were ghostly figures in the corners, and when I finally tried to sleep, it was like the universe had conspired against me. I would lurk in this weird half-state, where pain and dreams entwined, visions of shadows creeping closer until I screamed and awoke, drenched in sweat. My friends started noticing my change in demeanor. I isolated myself, avoiding social gatherings, dismissing my once beloved hobbies, and the simple act of getting out of bed became a ritual of agony. It was during an especially dark night, as I lay there staring into the crevices of my ceiling, hypnotized by an unfocused pain, that I came across another Reddit thread titled "The Shadowy Figure in My Room." The tale was narrated by a user describing how they were haunted by an entity that fed on physical pain. My mind racing, I thought it was ridiculous at first, but over time, the words twined into my fears until I noticed odd happenings around me. It felt like something was lurking deeper within the shadows cast by my shelves, creeping closer as if it knew I welcomed it because of my affliction. The nights blurred together, and the lines between lucid thought and delirium began to erode. I couldn't tell if the feverish whispers I heard were figments of a broken psyche or if they were something else entirely. As I stumbled out of bed one morning, I locked eyes with the dark mass in the corner of my room. It had no discernible shape, just a collection of swirling shadows, vibrating as if angry or hungry. The weight of my pain felt lighter, more bearable, but I realized it was because I could now recognize its original source. It seemed to pulse in unison with the shadow, like a grotesque dance we were doing, each time surging a little closer, whispering promises of relief if I took one more step into its darkness. I resisted at first, convinced it was my mind playing tricks, but the pain spoke to me differently now, urging me to give in, to let it consume me entirely. My friends reached out, asking me to join them for dinner, After days of ghosting them, I emerged from my seclusion only to find that their laughter cut through me like knives. The pain returned in full force. It wanted acknowledgement, and it was furious I tried to distract myself from it. That night, as I lay in bed, the oppressive presence filled my room once again. Shadows twisted and contorted on the walls, making it impossible to tell where my body ended and the darkness began. I felt paralyzed with familiarity, thoughts ricocheted through my head, the woman on Reddit, the figures in the corner, the unpredictable pain, and it dawned on me that I was being hunted. The shadow flourished, collecting my suffering like a monstrous trophy. As weeks fell into months, friendships having withered and vapors of sanity slipping away, I closed the door to my consciousness, walking willingly into that abyss, finding that surrender birthed a different type of pain, the one that left you hollow and empty. I became a shell of the person I once was, mutable under pressure, molded by darkness until I became it. The irony became too thick for my heart. So many had warned me about physical aches, but the anguish of despair disguised as comfort was the torment I never saw coming. My body faded, but the realities that bind our existence, friendship, joy, light, all retreated like mist, leaving behind a gaping void where the shadows reigned supreme. And as I reflect on that initial Reddit post, I want to warn you, underestimating the pain of losing yourself is far more crippling than any barbell dropping on your spine could ever be. I've always been the kind of person who found joy in the simple pleasures of life, Sunday morning cartoons, the smell of fresh coffee, and that eerie thrill of exploring an abandoned building late at night. But let me tell you, my darkest guilty pleasure, one that I think everyone should try at least once, took an unexpected turn into something terrifying. It started innocently enough with a post I saw on Reddit. What's a guilty pleasure you think everyone should try at least once? I vividly remember scrolling through the thread, laughing at the absurd suggestions, when one comment caught my eye: go ghost hunting in an old asylum. It'll change your perspective on fear. Being a sucker for a good adrenaline rush, I put together a plan. I'd go to the old St. Mary's Asylum, long abandoned on the outskirts of town, and spend the night with nothing but a flashlight and my phone for company, live tweeting my experience as I went, because nothing could go wrong, right? Armed with enthusiasm and the slight buzz of fear, I arrived at the dilapidated building an hour past dusk, the moon hanging low and heavy in the sky like an unexpected omen. The bricks were worn down and crumbling, ivy creeping up the facade as if the earth itself was trying to reclaim what it had lost, and although a chill ran down my spine, I shrugged it off as mere excitement. As I stepped through the splintered door, the heavy smell of mildew hit me, almost welcoming me into its dark embrace, and I switched on my flashlight, illuminating long-forgotten halls that whispered secrets of sorrow. My heart raced when I heard whispers coming from the depths of the building, accompanied by the creaking of the floorboards beneath me as if the very structure was alive. I chuckled nervously, convincing myself it was just the wind, or possibly my vivid imagination spurred into a frenzy by the numerous ghost stories I'd consumed over the years. But as I wandered deeper into the asylum, past rusting gurneys and peeling paint, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, and it wasn't just the remnants of the past lingering around me. It felt darker, sinister even, as if I had disturbed something that should have remained undisturbed. My phone buzzed with notifications, people urging me to keep going, sharing their own ghostly encounters, which only spurred my bravado. After all, I was the fearless ghost hunter, right? That was until I reached the basement, the air thick with an oppressive silence. It was there that a gut-wrenching dread settled in, making it harder to breathe, and when my flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows across the walls, I felt a primal instinct telling me to leave. But just as I turned to go, a soft, barely decipherable voice called out to me, "Stay with us." A shiver crawled up my spine, as the excitement I'd felt earlier turned to icy terror. I couldn't tell if I was hallucinating or if the darkness was playing tricks on my mind, but the clarity in that voice set alarms blaring through every fiber of my being. My heart raced as I stumbled back towards the stairs, but I found myself nearly frozen in place when I saw figures emerging from beneath the flickering light of my phone. They were translucent and dressed in hospital gowns, their faces twisted in pain, mouths moving in silent screams. Panic surged through me, and despite the overwhelming urge to bolt, I was rooted by a morbid curiosity. Was this really happening, or was my mind simply breaking under the weight of fear? In that moment, I remembered the online thread, the comment that sparked all of this, and a horrifying thought crossed my mind. What if this was a trap set by someone who knew the asylum was alive with spirits? Yet I still couldn't bring myself to leave. My feet were locked in place by both terror and a grim fascination. "We want to show you," the voice whispered again. And without thinking, I took a hesitant step forward, compelled by the strange pull of everything I had ever been curious about. Suddenly, I was made painfully aware of the coldness that enveloped my body, a chill that seeped into my bones as the apparitions closed in. I wanted to scream but no sound would come out, and in that moment, I understood the truth behind their mournful faces. They were trapped, just like me, eternally cursed to haunt this miserable place. I turned to run, but the shadows rushed at me, pulling me back into the darkness that thickened around me like fog, and no matter how hard I fought, it was as though the very air grew heavy, making escape impossible. I felt the cold hands of the lost souls wrap around my wrists, their grip tightening, echoing my own internal panic. "Join us!" They intoned in unison, their voices swirling around me, dulling my senses. I don't remember how long I struggled or how many times I called out for help. My screams faded into the echo of forgotten memories until I lost my voice entirely, until the shadows consumed me, and just when I thought I would be another ghostly face in that endless horror, a sudden flash of light broke through the darkness. I stumbled, blinded, only to find myself back in the basement, all traces of the apparitions gone, my phone vibrating chaotically in my pocket. Heart pounding and breath hitching, I stumbled out of the asylum, the specter of those haunting faces trailing behind me even as I fled into the night. I never spoke of what happened that night to anyone. As far as they knew, my ghost hunting was just a fun, harmless adventure gone awry, but I'll never forget the hollow echoes of their pleas. They say that your guilty pleasures can sometimes lead to unexpected revelations, but I came to realize that not all explorations are meant to be undertaken. If you're ever tempted to hunt for ghosts in an old asylum, ask yourself, how high is the price of satisfaction, and are you truly willing to pay it? Because the unseen world holds secrets that can change everything you believe in. And trust me, some pleasures come with a heavy curse. I've always hated Mark. We grew up in the same neighborhood, played on the same soccer team, but to me, he was like a gnarled thorn lodged deep in my side, an ever-present source of irritation who, for some sick reason, thrived on making my life miserable. So when I stumbled upon that Ask Reddit thread, asking what slight inconvenience you would wish upon the person you hate the most for the rest of their lives, a dark glee filled my heart as I read through the comments, but nothing resonated with me like the idea of perpetually slow Wi-Fi. I imagined him agonizing over buffering Netflix shows, video calls lagging just enough to freeze his smug grin in awkward moments, and his attempts to work from home, endless frustration tapping away at his sanity. Then it hit me, what if I took it a step further? I dug deeper into the lore of curses. In our age of digital interconnectedness, I decided to find solace in the invisible, the untraceable, and the haunting power of suggestion. I found an online forum hidden in the depths of the dark web, featuring dubious accounts of rituals that promised to lay burdens that could corrode happiness. I laughed at the absurdity of it, but something primal within me began to stir as I read about a curse of gradual inconvenience. I decided to conduct a little experiment. Using my laptop, I typed out my intention to bind Mark to endless inconvenience, proclaiming it like a mantra, feeding the insatiable resentment with every keystroke, and click after click, I submitted my request into the void. That week, I noticed odd happenings in Mark's life. His car inexplicably broke down, his favorite coffee shop was out of his beloved scone every morning, and the packages he ordered would arrive 2 days late, each occurrence adding fuel to my twisted satisfaction. The taste of sweet revenge coursed through my veins as Mark's world became a series of small, irritable moments that I could almost feel reverberate with my own malicious energy. But then I began receiving ominous replies on the forum, strange messages that taunted me, reminding me that every action has a consequence. I brushed it off, not wanting to acknowledge the creeping dread seeping through my thoughts, but even as I relished watching Mark's life deteriorate into a series of unfortunate events, I started experiencing minor inconveniences myself. Keys misplaced, traffic jams at every turn, and the labyrinthine lines at the grocery store where I seemed to select the slowest checkout lane each time. At first, I chalked it up to uncanny coincidence, but soon it escalated to full-blown chaos. My phone would crackle with static when mourning the loss of my favorite show, my computer would crash without warning right as I finished important projects, emails would go missing, leaving me in a quagmire of frustration that mirrored Mark's. It was as if the curse was slipping from my grasp and circling back to my life, and just when I thought it couldn't get worse, my childhood nemesis became aware of my distress. He reached out to me, cryptic messages laced with confusion and almost pity. He was experiencing the strain of his own life's misfortunes, which only intensified my paranoia. I felt trapped in this cyclical madness, my attempts to pull back from the curse proving futile as it tightened its grip like an illicit vice. As weeks passed, the inconveniences morphed into something sinister. I caught glimpses of shadows darting through the periphery of my vision, whispers tantalizing my consciousness at night when I should have been resting, and a nagging feeling that Mark was unwittingly connected to this spiral downwards. Even my sleep became punctuated by vivid nightmares, scenarios where every inconvenience I wished upon him manifested in my life tenfold, complex labyrinths of delays trapping me like a rat in an ever-tightening maze. One evening, after yet another day of horror, my internet went down during a critical presentation. I stood outside staring at the neighborhood as an unsettling realization clawed its way to the surface. Mark was not just a detached rival anymore, but a mirror reflecting my own dark intent. Perhaps by wishing for his suffering, I unknowingly invited my own. Desperate answers rooted deep within the recesses of the forum dug up a last-ditch ritual that promised to sever ties with malignant energies. However, it came at a cost. I was instructed to confront Mark, face him in person and, upon revealing my malicious intentions, offered to lift the curse, granting him an unexpected boon. The thought of looking into his eyes, to admit my deep-seated hatred, immediately terrifying yet exhilarating. So, I called him, the phone trembling in my grip as I reluctantly ventured into his neighborhood, my heart pounding harder with each passing streetlight. When I arrived, knocking on that familiar door felt like cracking open a long dormant hell. The door swung open, and Mark stood there, bewildered but strangely calm. After the initial awkwardness faded, I feigned the casual air of someone wanting to catch up, but the words poured out of me as if my tongue was a runaway train. I told him everything, the curse, my hatred, my obsession, how I never wanted to admit that I had become the architect of my own misery. To my shock, he listened intently, his eyes widening not with anger, but with what I could only interpret as understanding, a twisted recognition of how the wounds of our childhood had interconnected like vines, choking the life from both of us. He spoke then, his voice steady as he revealed the toll of my actions. He quipped that he had sensed something vile brewing behind his trifling inconveniences. Yet as we stood in that dimly lit entryway, I saw the shadows coil around us, the weight of the curse lingered in the air, both of us locked in this grotesque acknowledgement that we were bound together in our shared hatred, like two characters cursed by an unseen puppeteer. We agreed to end it right there, a pact forged in the fragile air of a shared conversation. I left his house that night with a sense of catharsis, believing I had narrowly escaped the clutches of the curse, believing that I could flush the bitterness out of my life, but as the sun set behind me, a perpetual shroud of dread fell upon my soul. My phone buzzed incessantly with the same messages I had received earlier, but this time they were accompanied by images, of Mark's face twisted in anguish. I glanced at the time, and it struck me, the last inconvenience had taken root, and with it, the realization that the curse had no intention of relinquishing its hold. My life spiraled out of control. It became clear that this was only the beginning. Bit by bit, troubling echoes of discontent chased me into the shadows, calling out my name as if to say I had woven my own fate into the fabric of someone else's torment. Every rage-induced thought I'd sent into the void had returned tenfold, curses crystallizing to form the prison I now inhabited, and each day felt like another chapter in a never-ending nightmare where Mark's inconveniences were now my own, and the slight was no longer separate from me but fused with every part of my being, inviting me to wonder, was I the puppet? Or merely the marionette left to dance on their strings? When I was a kid, the local bowling alley was the heart of our small town, a fluorescent-lit refuge from the boredom of summer days and endless school year afternoons. But it wasn't just the clatter of bowling pins or the greasy scent of pizza that kept us coming back, it was the secret that turned the cheer of friendly competition into something darker, something we whispered about behind cupped hands while shoving dollar bills into the arcade machines. It all started one Friday night, when my friends and I were goofing around on the lane, creating ridiculous routines for our roles, but as I set my sights on the last pin, a sharp screech echoed from the back of the alley, where the old ball return machine sat, untouched and neglected. We all froze, laughter grinding to a halt, and my friend Sam, who was always desperate to prove he wasn't scared of anything, dared us to investigate. With the bravado of 12-year-olds, we crept toward the back, accompanied only by the whining hum of the flickering lights overhead. The ball return sat ominously still, but a chill wound its way through my bones when I noticed the dim light from an open door just beyond it. An inexplicable force pulled me closer to that door, maybe it was curiosity. Or maybe it was the very real sense that every horror movie we had ever watched was bubbling to the surface of my mind. With a shared nod of defiance, we shuffled our way through the darkened lane, shoes squeaking against the scuffed wooden floor as we edged toward the door, which was slightly ajar. Inside the room, the musty air hit us first, and amid the dust motes dancing like tiny ghosts in the faint light, I noticed the strange piles of things, bowling balls, vintage shoes, and then something that sent my heart racing, a torn, yellowing newspaper clipping pinned crookedly to the wall. My fingers trembled as I ripped it free, revealing a headline about a boy who had vanished after a late-night birthday party at the very bowling alley we stood in, accompanied by a faded photo of him leaping in the air with a joyful grin, just a few lanes down from where we were now. My stomach twisted as I turned to my friends, their faces pale in the gloom, but my words died in my throat when I heard it, a soft thud, like heavy footsteps just outside the door, a sound eclipsed only by the sharp intake of my breath. Desperate to break the suffocating silence, I called out, "Hello?" But the only response was the unsettling scrape of something heavy sliding against the ground, and that's when Sam bolted, yanking the door wide open and stumbling back onto the lane, shouting that we needed to go. I was right behind him, barely glancing back, but just as we broke free, something reached out from the shadow behind the door, the glint of a half-hidden eye illuminated by the soft glow of the exit sign. We ran out into the main area, hearts hammering against our rib cages, but the night was still ringing in our ears, laughter and arcade sounds resumed around us, but we knew better. We had stumbled onto something ancient, something best left undisturbed. The next week, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Everywhere I turned, I felt heavy eyes pressing into my back, so I told my friends about it, convinced they'd back me up, but they laughed it off like nothing had happened. Maybe I was imagining things, but when I snuck over to bowl again, the shadows felt deeper, almost alive. The same door we had opened loomed larger than before, but I was too afraid to approach it. Then came the whispers. Late at night, while laying in bed, I would hear muffled voices curling into my ears like smoke, talking about the boy who never came home, the children who were never seen again. When I confided in my mother, she just sighed, brushing it off as leftover childhood fears, but I had learned better than to doubt my gut. Weeks turned to months, and the whispers grew persistent, almost pleading, and when Sam finally backed out of our friendship, insisting he wanted nothing more to do with that cursed place, I felt utterly alone. It was during one sleepless night, a couple of weeks later, that I accidentally stumbled into the alley while out on a homesick walk, the urge pulling me back against all reason. I could hear the familiar sounds of bowling balls rolling and pins clattering, but something was off. The laughter coming from the lanes felt thick and strained, almost as if it were laced with something sinister. I steered clear of the door leading to that back room, but as I got ready to leave, a cold gust of wind made me look back, and in place of that heavy door stood the boy from the clipping, his lips moving like he was trying to form words, pleading for something I couldn't understand. My heart felt like it would burst. The boy was the spitting image of the one from the photo, and he wore an old bowling jersey with his name stitched across the front, a name I would come to know all too well. Panic set in. I turned and ran, but this time the resounding thuds echoed from behind me, chasing me out into the parking lot, the shadows of the alley stretching with a hungry grasp. I was nearly to my car when a hand clutched my ankle from the darkness, sending me tumbling, and just as I turned to face whatever had reached out, those eyes glinted again, sharper, as if made of the void itself, flickering between the child and a nightmare I could hardly comprehend. I managed to scramble up and yank the car door open, slamming it shut just as I saw him move at the edge of the light, shadows swirling behind him like a spool of silk woven into the darkness. In that moment, everything I thought I knew about what lurked below the bowling alley came crashing down. I realized the truth behind the whispers. It wasn't just a boy, it was a warning, a harbinger of the lost, a warning for the ones who were next, and that summer, one way or another, I would soon become a part of the story. It was a late night at the office, just me and my thoughts sitting in the glow of my computer screen, when I casually opened up Reddit to distract myself from the demands of my life. I stumbled upon a thread titled "What's the most NSFW thing you witnessed at a workplace?" and began to scroll through the comments, each more shocking than the last, but one particular reply caught my attention, and as I read it, I felt the weight of my own experience pulling me back to a time and place I'd tried to bury deep within my memories. It had been my first job out of college, a junior marketing position at a firm downtown that came with all the typical office politics and whispered secrets, the kind of stuff you only read about in cheesy novels. There was one coworker, Sarah, who was both captivating and erratic, with laughter that made you forget the weight of the world while gripping her black coffee like it was her lifeline. One evening, as the fluorescent lights flickered and the hum of printers filled the silence, Sarah invited me to join her for a drink after work at a nearby bar that quickly turned into frequent escapades filled with too many secrets, her laughter mingling with baffling stories that towed the line of scandalous. As our friendship deepened, she confided in me about her obsession with this sultry romance novel that had been making rounds at the office, claiming it was based on a true story involving an affair between a boss and an intern. with crazy plot twists that felt all too realistic in the dimly lit break room where I first learned about the dark underbelly of the workplace. We'd often joke about how real life would never be that dramatic, until one evening when the gravity of her words pulled us back to a night that would prove otherwise. The entire office was invited to a team-building rooftop party, which started lighthearted enough with drinks and laughter but quickly spiraled as the drinks flowed, revealing hidden truths and raw desires, and I remember glancing over at Sarah, her eyes sparkling with mischief as she whispered wild ideas about what could happen if things went awry. As the night wore on, employees began to pair off, loose inhibitions and revealing intentions, leaving a trail of heated exchanges that simmered beneath the otherwise professional atmosphere. That was when I turned to find Sarah, standing closer than ever to her boss, Greg, whose easy charm and smug confidence were magnetizing in a way that made the room feel stifling. I watched, captivated and horrified, as she reached up to whisper something in his ear, the tips of her fingers dancing briefly down the collar of his shirt, while the rest of us were frozen in our laughter, oblivious or perhaps too afraid to fully comprehend what was unfolding before us. The air was electric, filled with an unspoken agreement between coworkers that this absurd charade was somehow permissible, that we were all just players in a sick game, and out of nowhere, Greg's hand brushed against Sarah's waist, a gesture that seemed casual but felt like an earthquake jolting the foundation of our office ethics, wrapping around my chest as I struggled to breathe. I could hear the laughter echoing distantly as the clock approached midnight, and even through the haze of alcohol and thrill, a part of me screamed that we were crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. When Sarah and Greg disappeared in a swath of crinkled sheets and red lips back at the office, I was left standing on the rooftop, utterly paralyzed with the realization that the secrets shared over drinks had evolved into something dangerously NSFW and that the office buzz would never be quite the same again. That night marked the beginning of a series of events that laid bare vulnerabilities and shards of shattered trust among co-workers who had previously prided themselves on professionalism, unraveling over the weeks that followed, punctuated by hushed whispers and sidelong glances, as we all began to wonder how Sarah and Greg would play this charade. It was only weeks later, during a seemingly normal Monday meeting, that we received the announcement of Greg's promotion, complete with applause that felt like nails on my skin, while Sarah sat across the table, an ill-concealed smile spread wide across her face, knowing full well the danger of allegiance in our twisted office dynamic. Conversation soon shifted from work to flirtation, an atmosphere fraught with tension that proved to be dangerously intoxicating, leading to clandestine meetups shrouded in secrecy, tainted by adrenaline and fueled by both attraction and the fear of exposure. As days turned into weeks, and rumors began to swirl like a thick fog of confusion around our desks, the entire office felt like a pressure cooker on the verge of explosion, and I, trapped within the maelstrom of desire and betrayal, couldn't shake the feeling that we were teetering on the edge of uncharted territories, caught between loyalty to one another and the irrefutable truth that intimacy breeds chaos. The final twist came on a Friday that still haunts me, when Sarah strutted into the office with a confidence that felt alien yet magnetic. It was a day of decisions, and as whispers grew louder and explicit text messages merged into late-night calls, the recklessness materialized before our eyes in a shocking display that left me breathless. She called my name, beckoning me to witness something, anything, that would usher us into the line of no return, and in that moment, everything snapped into focus. I stood frozen, confronted by the evolution of ordinary office life into a perilous game of shadows, secrets, and sexual tension. The affair pushed boundaries beyond repair, and Sarah's gleeful laughter echoed hauntingly as echoes of "Where do you draw the line?" eyed the corners of my consciousness, tearing apart the last threads of innocence I clung to while grappling with questions that would echo in my mind for years to come. I could hardly bring myself to leave work that night. As Sarah's laughter filled the air and excitement reached fever pitch, I knew nothing would ever be the same at that office, and ultimately, I lost more than just a friend. I lost faith in the sanctity of professionalism, and as the evening wore on and the unforgivable happened, I realized that sometimes, the most NSFW things witnessed in a workplace are not the scandalous acts themselves, but rather the erosion of trust that ripples through the entire environment like poison. And as I walked away from the roiling undercurrents of greed and folly, I told myself it was finally time to escape that wretched place before we were turned into only a distant memory, forever tainted by betrayals buried deep beneath the facade of professionalism. For the first 2 years of our relationship, Jenna's sleep-talking was an odd quirk I found charming. She'd mumble about forgotten grocery lists or converse with invisible dream friends, never saying anything more alarming than an occasional giggle or grumble. But last night was different. I was jolted awake by the icy tone in her usually gentle voice, cold enough to raise the hairs on my neck. Through the dim glow of moonlight filtering through the blinds, I could barely make out her form, lying still and silent beside me. I heard her murmur, clear as day, "The bodies are buried behind the old shed, where the soil runs deep." Startled, I sat up, debating whether to wake her, but something in my gut told me to just listen. My mind raced. Could she have learned about some unpublicized crime? We live in a small town where rumors spread like wildfire, and I am very familiar with tales of the Jenkins farm, abandoned for decades, said to be haunted. I dismissed it as idle gossip, but Jenna's somber tone lingered long after she fell back into a tranquil sleep. This newfound revelation clung to me throughout the night, like a shadow I couldn't shake. I sifted through the bizarre possibilities. Was Jenna sleep-talking about a dream? A TV show she watched subconsciously projected into her nocturnal monologue? Or was there dread tightening in my chest at the realization of the most chilling possibility? Was there some truth to it? She spoke with a conviction uncharacteristic for a dream. This wasn't a nonsensical string of dream fragments, it was deliberate. I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to investigate. When morning arrived, Jenna emerged from sleep stretching and yawning, seemingly oblivious to the secrets spilled by her unconscious mind. It gnawed at me throughout breakfast, curious glances exchanged between her anecdotes of banal office gossip and weekend plans. My patience wore thinner as the day dragged on, an itch I couldn't scratch, the urge to scour the grounds of the fabled Jenkins farm overtaking all rational thought. A restless compulsion led me to concoct a flimsy excuse about needing to run an errand out of town, and with Jenna's weekend plans unfolding smoothly, it was surprisingly easy to slip away unnoticed. I found myself driving out to the edge of town, the air thick with the metallic scent of impending rain and apprehension. The road to the Jenkins farm was rugged, lined with skeletal trees clinging desperately to the last of their autumn leaves. Upon arrival, the place was as desolate as I'd heard, an ominously silent witness to years of neglect. The shed stood where legends claimed, grotesque in its decay, vines strangling its weary structure. Doubts tugged at me as I circled its perimeter warily, the earth beneath my feet somehow feeling both stable and suggestive. With each step, Jenna's words echoed insistently, "Where the soil runs deep." Spurred by a nameless urgency, I fetched the rusted shovel I'd haphazardly grabbed from our garage, and began to dig beneath the drooping oaks bordering the shed, roots twisted like dormant fingers guarding the land's secrets. Every jarring clang of metal against rock was like a bell toll affirming my madness. The hole deepened, sweat mingling with the onset of panic, when finally, I uncovered something. The sickening realization hit before I fully saw it, a hint of fabric, grotesque and moldering, half revealed in the dirt. The sight of bones, time-bleached and hauntingly devoid of flesh, sent my pulse hammering in my ears. The air grew thicker, weighted with the silent screams of the secrets entombed beneath my shaking hands. All senses implored me to turn and flee, but primal fear nailed me in place, drawn irrationally to the irrevocable proof of Jenna's nighttime confession. I stumbled backward, breathless, the ground tipping beneath the overwhelming gravity of discovery. My phone buzzed in my pocket, Jenna's name lighting up the screen. I hesitated, entangled in a web of conspiracy and impending terror. With a sinking heart, I answered, scanning the spectral scene before me, wrestling with how to confront this damning truth. Her voice, cheerful and oblivious on the line, felt foreign now. I couldn't unsee, couldn't unknow. As her words continued, animated with laughter at some distant point now entirely trivial, I lacked the fortitude to feign normalcy any longer. Lost for words, my voice cracked forth in a tremor I failed to mask. "Jenna, we need to talk." In the breathless pause that followed, I steeled myself against the avalanche of coming revelations which promised to erase the innocent veneer of our shared lives. Silence simmered on the line, pregnant with 1,000 unsaid truths. The color of the world drained under the austere judgment of twilight, and I was left standing alone amidst a sea of ashen evidence, my soul a shipwreck on the shores of disquiet. I never thought I'd be the one writing here, sharing something so bizarre it might shatter illusions of sanity, yet here I am. It started when Alice, my cheerful 8-year-old daughter, began exhibiting some unsettling behavior, something that has gnawed at the very edges of my reality. We live in a quiet suburb, where neighbors exchange smiles over fences, and the most scandalous gossip involves stray cats and misplaced garden gnomes. Nothing ever happens here. But everything shifted within the walls of my own home about 3 months ago. It was an ordinary evening when I realized something was not right with Alice. Although incidents began subtly, like when I found her speaking softly to the closet as if it were a friend. "Who are you talking to, sweetie?" I asked lightly, half expecting an imaginary friend, a rite of passage for children her age. Alice simply turned to me, her face a mask of confusion, and said, "Can't you see him, Mommy? It's Owen. He says he's from before." A chill crept down my spine, but I dismissed it, assuming it was just an odd phase. But over time, her conversations grew more complex, involving details that an 8-year-old could not have concocted. They were full of a history she had never learned, with chaotic whispers of places and times none of us had ever been. Then came the drawings. At first, they seemed like the typical scribbles of a child, vibrant and rough. But soon, they evolved into unsettling depictions of faces that were almost lifelike in their grotesqueness, accompanied by strange symbols that seemed ancient, etched with an eerie precision. My husband, James, reassured me, attributing her creativity to our genes as he was an artist himself in college. I tried to shake the growing unease, but then there were the nights where shadows seemed to live within her room, moving inexplicably as if her words had summoned unseen guests. One stormy night, power flickered from the heavens, the room falling into an ominous glow, and I heard a muffled giggling from her room. I opened the door stealthily, only for the light to burst back alive, revealing Alice mid-conversation with thin air, her gaze unsettlingly focused. The room went cold, the type of cold you feel in your bones, despite the howling summer winds. "He says the light hurts him," Alice explained nonchalantly, pointing to the oldest corner of the room, a spot that had always inexplicably felt a degree colder than the rest. I took a step back, feeling a presence pass through me like a gust of winter, whispering in a tongue that was both familiar and foreign. The sensation left me breathless, and it was the following morning I noticed the bruises. Faint, translucent markings on Alice's arms, shaped like fingerprints but disappearing much too quickly to be examined closely. Desperation drew me to a historian friend, hoping to claw at any semblance of an explanation. "The symbols," he muttered, squinting at the papers Alice had covered with her eerie artistry. "These are sigils, ancient ones, used in rituals to summon entities, supposedly." Supposedly. The word echoed in my mind, roiling with the impossible jumble of fear and denial. Yet, all the while, Alice remained unfazed, her once bright demeanor becoming more detached, as if she were being pulled elsewhere, piece by piece. I soon started experiencing sleep disturbances, vivid nightmares where shadowy figures would beckon me, scalding me with their icy touch. Shadows that resembled the faces Alice had drawn, as if trying to reach out beyond the canvas into her waking world. I would wake to find Alice standing by her bedside, staring at James or me, her eyes cloudy as if she weren't herself. When confronted, Alice mentioned rememberings of another era, flashes of life interwoven with ours. She called them echoes, fragments of past lives yet to fade away completely. "Owen says it will be okay," she'd repeat, her voice a thing of comfort despite the horror of her words. We sought help, a psychologist, who dismissed it as a vivid imagination seeking attention, completely ignoring the etched oddities continuing to scratch across our reality. But James and I knew. There was something inexplicably altered about our daughter, a tether linking her to our world and another we could never understand. The final straw snapped quiet as a winter breeze the night I awoke to find Alice gone. Frantic, we searched the house, only to see the front door ajar, swinging open slowly as if summoned. We found her at the edge of the woods at the border of our neighborhood, standing under the haunting stare of the full moon. I shouted her name, but she simply turned and grinned with an expression that was not hers. It was a smirk too mature, too knowing. Her eyes danced with shadows, flickering entities neither dead nor alive but caught between what was and what could never be. "Owen wants me to come home," she said, and her voice, chillingly calm, echoed in the night air. It took everything in us to pull her back, and in that moment of contact, time lost meaning, and a flurry of echoes surged within, the sensation of multiple lives intertwining. We saw glimpses of Alice in different times, different eras, always alongside the enigmatic silhouette of a little boy, Owen, his eyes like bottomless pits holding secrets of forgotten worlds. Since that night, Alice sleeps better, or at least she pretends to. There's a tranquility that she exudes now, one that's oddly unnatural, knowing. But I no longer feel safe under the same roof, as if I'm sharing my daughter with something beyond my comprehension. The bedroom corner is colder still, and sometimes, reflections in the mirror seem to lag, replaying moments in a disjointed echo as if time there does not adhere to the same rules. We're reaching out to specialists in paranormal studies, as much as the idea terrifies us, for the gravest fear lies in not knowing what we have allowed into our lives. All I know is, something is not right with Alice, and whatever it is, it's growing stronger with each passing day. My brother Michael has been missing for over a year, the kind of disappearance that leaves your heart twisted in knots, your family shattered, and your mind racing with dark thoughts. I spent countless nights scanning local news reports, feverishly checking social media, and stumbling upon conspiracy theories that claimed he was kidnapped, or worse. So you can imagine the whirlwind of emotions that ripped through me when I stumbled upon an old, decrepit zoo on the edge of town, a place that was supposedly shut down due to manners of unethical treatment, according to hastily scrawled notices on the crumbling entrance gates. I had heard whispers about that place, a dilapidated remnant of happier times that were now steeped in local lore about missing children and secret experiments. Unable to shake the feeling that I had to see for myself, I ventured inside under the cover of a twilight sky, the fading light making everything feel surreal, as the shadows of abandoned cages loomed like skeletons over the path. The air was thick with an unpleasant, musty smell, each breath filled with the mingling scent of decay and something more sinister, an almost electric anticipation that prickled my skin. I wandered deeper into the zoo, passing empty enclosures where rusted metal bars groaned in the wind, their stories long forgotten but etched into my psyche with every footstep echoing through the silence. Then I heard it, a faint sound, a whimper or cry, deep and guttural echoing from the far end of the grounds, a sound that made my heart race and my skin crawl. I stumbled through the overgrown weeds and faded paths, my pulse hammering in my ears, as I finally reached a dilapidated building that looked like it hadn't seen light in years. A sign above the door read "Employee Break Room," but the moment I pushed the door open, the hinges screeched like a banshee and the stench hit me like a wall. Inside, the air thickened with something rancid, making it hard to breathe. And then, I saw him, Michael. My heart soared and plummeted in the same horrifying instant. He was there, but he wasn't alone. Caged like a wild animal in what might have once been a snack shack, he was emaciated and scared, eyes wide with a terrible recognition that somehow made me feel more like a stranger than a sister. I rushed towards him, but the sound of clanging metal and a monstrous growl halted me. Turning slowly, my breath caught in my throat as I faced the keeper, a gaunt figure cloaked in shadows, eyes gleaming with twisted fascination. He grinned, revealing yellowed teeth that gleamed like the bars of Michael's prison, and as he stepped into the light, I saw the scars crisscrossing his forearms, the remnants of some unspeakable dark past. "You found him," he rasped, the words dripping with a sinister delight. "But it comes at a price." I recoiled, my heart racing as he spoke about his collection, dark promises of freedom tangled with images too awful to comprehend. My brother, turned into something else, perhaps even a new challenge added to the grotesque menagerie he had gathered. Desperation clawed at my throat as I demanded to let Michael go, tears stinging my eyes. But all he did was laugh, a chilling sound that echoed in the empty zoo and bounced off the shadows crammed into the corners of my fear. "What's one life for a show that captivates?" he quipped, and my stomach dropped, the truth hitting me like a punch to the gut. The other animals weren't fading memories, they were the remnants of children, people just like my brother, who'd been claimed by this twisted man's insatiable hunger for his performers. I backed away slowly, the reality dawning on me that I may not be able to save him, not without unleashing hell. With a sudden, desperate resolve, I grabbed a rusted cage door and swung it at the keeper, catching him off guard just long enough to lunge toward Michael. But he was faster, too fast, and before I knew it, I was ensnared in the storm of cages surrounding us. With a roar of anger, the keeper lunged towards me, and I felt an icy hand grab my ankle just as I reached for Michael's hands, the suffocating panic giving way to a primal instinct to survive. I fought off the darkness invading my vision, adrenaline charging as I launched myself at him, and with a brute force driven by fear and love, I shoved him back, adrenaline firing every nerve in my body. The chaos erupted in blinding speed, the loud booming of steel hitting against steel, the keeper's growling rants growing softer as he stumbled, confused by the sudden change in power dynamics. It was just a moment, a breath, but it was enough for me to reach Michael, to pull him into my embrace, but the keeper wasn't finished yet. With a roar, he lunged once more, the timber of his frame barreling into us like a freight train, but fate had other plans. The ceiling overhead succumbed to years of neglect, and in a cloud of dust and debris, we found ourselves sprawling on the ground, free at last. But as I turned to grab Michael, he wasn't reaching for me the way I'd hoped. He stood frozen, staring into the yawning darkness that had engulfed the keeper, hope flickering in his eyes replaced by a dreadful understanding. "It's too late for me," he whispered, voice trembling. My heart shattered with each second that passed, and as the echoes of the past rumbled through the broken zoo, I knew I should have saved him instead. The shadows of the cages whispered his name with lingering regret as we both heard sirens in the distance, but even as they neared, I felt an icy chill creep through my core. I wasn't sure if they would be here in time, or if they would even want to save him. With one last look back at the abyss, I urged him to come with me, pulling him towards the exit, heart pounding against the ticking clock of reality, praying against all dire chances that my brother was still the brother I knew, that nothing worse had slithered into his soul. But as we stumbled over the threshold and into the night, I realized the zoo was still very much alive with the echoes of its past, and even now, a new child was making its way toward the entrance without a clue about the horrors that lurked behind the rusted bars.